Hello everyone, and welcome to the extinct, abandoned, and defunct Disneyland Iceberg. In this video, we'll take a look back at all of the fun, lost, and obscure attractions from the Disneyland resorts in Southern California. We will be looking at everything that Disney has tried covering up in the past, from guests and cast members dying in the Disney parks, to the awesome and will-be-missed attractions that have remnants in Disneyland, to just the plain weird rides that Disney thought would be a good idea. For those that have been watching my channel since the very beginning, you are probably well aware of the fact that this has been a running series on the channel and that I just posted the finale this week. It's a bit much to ask everyone to go back and watch the 5-part series as it was intended, so to make things more digestible and easy, I went ahead and re-edited the entire series, taking out all of the old intros and outros as well as any outdated information. I did this to make everything more digestible and able to watch it in one big go. As with all of my videos, the description and pinned comment will have timestamps in regard to every single ride and when each layer starts. So if you really don't want to watch one particular layer or ride, you can go ahead and skip over it and just skip to whatever part you really want to watch. I have tried my best with each attraction to give an accurate description of what it might have been like to experience them when they were all back up and running. From taking you through the line cues to actually riding the entire attraction, and even giving some context as to how the rides came to be and why they were taken out. So without further ado, let's kick this thing off by getting into Layer 1. Layer 1 isn't too exciting, and honestly if I were you, I would just skip over to Layer 2. I only say this because Layer 1 just has a lot of recent closures and changes and nothing really too cool to talk about. It's mostly just stuff that's happening right now. It also has a ton of YouTube channels and common sources for Disneyland history knowledge. Defunct Disneyland Media. So in my original video, I explained each item in Layer 1, but this time around, I'm going to be lumping all of those YouTube channels in Layer 1 into just one category. This is mostly because every single YouTube channel that's on this iceberg is pretty much the same exact thing when it comes to Disneyland lore. Most of them have created a ton of history videos dedicated to preserving discontinued or defunct amusement park rides, with some of them having a huge emphasis on Disneyland history, such as Offhand Disney or Disney Dan. One channel that is completely absent from Layer 1 is Mountaineer Productions, and I wanted to shed some light on this channel because I feel like it deserves a lot more attention. Mountaineer Productions' Historyland series single-handedly helped me research a lot of the items on this iceberg, just because it gave me a really good starting place to start my research. So huge shoutouts to Mountaineer Productions and helping me with the iceberg, and if you guys are going to check out any of these channels, I highly recommend checking out their Historyland series. This will bring us to Layer 2. Layer 2 specifically covers a lot of the popular and known extinct attractions that most casual Disney fans should know about. Let's kick Layer 2 off with the first item, the Main Street Electrical Parade. The Main Street Electrical Parade was a nighttime parade that isn't like most parades at Disneyland. Most of the parades at Disneyland take place during the day. This means you're left with the hot sun beating down on you while you try your best to get any seats that will allow for a good angle of the parade. That is a typical experience trying to get to see one of these iconic spectacles. However, the Main Street Electrical Parade was different. It had these bright lights flashing everywhere. It had some of the most infectious techno dance music of all time. And best of all, it took place only at nighttime, which meant that no matter the viewing angle, you always got to see some awesome lights dancing their way down Main Street. Now I expect that most Disney goers know about this parade from its run in 2017 at the Disneyland Resort in Southern California. But unbeknownst to a lot of park goers nowadays, the parade has actually been around for a lot longer. Its original run began in the California Disneyland Park from 1972 all the way until 1996. Before it premiered in 1972, during the first rehearsal of the parade, a float crashed into a building on Main Street while some performers' costumes emitted sparks. Eventually, the parade would successfully debut on June 17, 1972. The original spectacle in 1972 consisted of 2D style floats that were carried by people down Main Street. It got a huge update from this point on, as you can see from these pictures taken in the 1996 run. The parade featured such characters as Pinocchio, the Seven Dwarfs, Captain Hook, and other various Disney characters from that time. The parade would eventually close in light of a replacement show titled Light Magic, but the new parade was not well received. Unfortunately, the criticism received of the new light magic parade was not enough to prompt Disney to bring back the original electrical parade. We know this to be true, as Disneyland would not bring the original parade back until years later in 2017. During this time, the parade was featured at the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World, where it ran from 1999 to 2001. It would then reappear for 10 years, from 2010 to 2016 at the same park. After the 2016 run in the Magic Kingdom, the parade was then scheduled to be brought back to California's Disneyland Resort for a brief period of time. The initial plan was to have the parade come on January 20th of 2017 and end in that coming June. However, because of popular demand, the parade stayed in the park all the way to August 20th of the same year. It has made several appearances in the same Disneyland park, but knowing Disney, the parade will most likely come back briefly in the coming years. PeopleMover. The PeopleMover was a 16-minute ride that gave guests a unique view and tour of Disneyland's Tomorrowland. The ride gave a glimpse into various attractions, shows, and shops around the park. One part of the ride even included a view of Walt Disney's vision for the future, which would end up becoming the Epcot Center that we know from the Walt Disney World. A cool thing to note about the PeopleMover was that it was originally called the PeopleMover presented by Goodyear. The reason for this was because at the time, most of the rides in Tomorrowland were simply sponsored by bigger companies. For example, the Goodyear sponsor featured Goodyear tires on the tracks that were put every 9 feet, which is what made the track move. The PeopleMover was a big success when it saw its debut in Tomorrowland at the Disneyland Resort. The attraction was simply a transport attraction, meaning that it wasn't really a ride to get on to have fun, but more a chill ride to take a 10-minute break from all the walking you've done around the park. I imagine this, along with all that the ride had to offer, meant that it was the ultimate ride to get on to enjoy yourself while also getting some relaxing rest from all the time you spent walking through the park. The attraction first debuted in 1967 as part of Tomorrowland's makeover. The ride lasted all the way until 1996. The next part I wanted to mention about this ride goes over some serious injuries that actually resulted in death of some of the guests. So if you want to skip past this, go ahead and go to this timestamp. Now, with such a chill ride that literally went no faster than 10 miles per hour, you'd expect no accidents to occur on the ride, but this ride has actually had some pretty serious incidents. A few of the incidents that occurred resulted in a few injuries to some of the guests, as well as causing 2 deaths. The 2 deaths were caused by similar actions. Apparently, when this ride debuted, it became a sort of game amongst teenagers to jump between the moving vehicle cars. They did this because of how fun it made the ride. I can imagine how bored teenagers must have gotten on this ride, with it being 16 minutes of basically nothing. However, this mentality actually got 2 young men killed at 2 different times. In 1967, just 1 month after the attraction was open, a 16-year-old boy was killed while trying to jump between 2 moving vehicles on the ride. He stumbled mid-jump and was dragged a few hundred feet before the ride stopped. The same exact thing happened in June of 1980, when an 18-year-old man was crushed underneath the track while trying to jump between the moving cars. This accident occurred as the ride entered the superspeed tunnel. Besides the 2 deaths, there was another incident in 1972 where a teenage girl dropped her mouse ears on the track. The girl and her cousin hopped onto the track to retrieve her ears. They ended up getting her ears back, and the first girl was able to get back into the car successfully, but the second girl decided she'd just run through the tunnel and get out to the exit. In doing so, she actually ran out of the exit, but there was no flooring for her to stand on, so she ended up falling 30 feet below and sued Disney. Now, I don't know the whole story for why she sued, because it seems like it was her fault, but apparently she had a good case against them. Now, despite all these accidents, the PeopleMover was not closed until 1995. The ride wasn't even closed for the incidents either. It was closed because of yet another reimagining of Tomorrowland. The PeopleMover will be replaced by, funny enough, the next entry on the iceberg, Rocket Rods. Rocket Rods was the replacement ride for the PeopleMover. It was introduced to Tomorrowland in May 22nd of 1998 as a part of the newest remodel of the land. The ride was a more hyper and fast-paced version of the PeopleMover, as it used the exact same track layout. The only difference this time was that there was an actual track instead of the Goodyear wheels that pulled the carts around. The ride would start out doing a wheelie and then accelerate from 0 to 35 miles per hour, which by Disney standards at the time was pretty darn fast. This all sounded pretty good on paper, but unfortunately for the ride, the exhilarating experience was always cut short because of the track layout. As said before, the track layout was the exact same as the PeopleMover, which meant that it was not built for such a fast-paced experience. This was found to be true because the Rocket Rod's vehicle would always have to slow down at every single turn, and with how many turns the PeopleMover track originally had, it really put a damper down on the fast-paced nature of the ride. The actual ride itself would take you through Tomorrowland, much like its predecessor would, as you would race past the Star Tours line, but it was different now as some parts of the ride were now blocked off. Disney placed a mirror right here to block off a part of the view that was not originally blocked off on the PeopleMover ride, but was now blocked off on the Rocket Rod's version. This mirror also acted as a set piece that made you think you were going to collide with another vehicle, when in actuality, it was just used to disguise yet another slow turn. Other parts of the ride that were modified was this part right here where the view of the Starcade was completely blocked off. After this, you would rush past Space Mountain, but there wasn't even ample time to take in the view. The best part of the ride was near the end, when you would get a fantastic view of Tomorrowland and then get a glimpse into some construction which would eventually become the Innovention Center. As much good as the ride did, there was too many mistakes and mishaps that would frequently happen over the course of the ride's stay. The ride would frequently be stopped after experiencing several issues with the vehicles. Since the track was unchanged from the original ride, the amount of turns would cause each vehicle to constantly slow down and speed up, which completely screwed up the engines and would cause the ride to have constant maintenance and evacuations as a result. Another issue that was simply an oversight was the wait times to get on the ride. To add insult to injury, the amount of people that could get into one rocket was only 5 people, which meant the wait time would only get longer from here on out. The lines and wait times got so long that for the first time in Disneyland history, they introduced the single rider line. So all of you single rider fans can thank Rocket Rods for introducing us to this miracle of a solution. Honestly though, before I move on, I hate being the person that gets the single rider. It's always so awkward. Let me know your guys' personal experience with single riders. I always hate being the person that's stuck with the single rider. Anyways, if you thought that everything so far was bad, Rocket Rods would only go downhill from here, with one incident pushing the ride very close to its inevitable demise. During one run of the Rocket Rods ride, a brake chute broke off a vehicle and flew into the crowd in Tomorrowland. To be fair, this was actually a rumor, but even so, all of these issues only took place within the first month of it opening. The ride would close and open back up 3 months later, but it still had so many operational issues that it was forced to close down yet again within the next 2 years in the year 2000. The ride was set to open back up in spring of 2001 with new lights on the ride and a new color scheme, but when the reopening date came and went, fans realized that the ride would be closed for good. Eventually, Disney would come out and officially state the ride was closed. Now, the sad thing is that the remnants of the PeopleMover and the Rocket Rods ride can still be seen today in Tomorrowland. Only now, it's a shell of its former self, with the tracks being riddled with rust and trees trying their best to cover up one of Disney's biggest failures. The obvious decision here would be to bring one of the rides back, but that was shown to be far too expensive as the track is far too rusted and requires lots of money to tear out the old track and to put a new one in, which would also cause a lot of construction to be done around all of Tomorrowland. The next obvious choice would be to rip it out of the park entirely, but because the track was built right into Tomorrowland's structure, ripping it out entirely would cause way too much work to be done for little reward. So now the track sits atop the Tomorrowland scenery as a reminder of an attraction that guests may never get to experience again. Original DCA Entrance. Ah yeah, the original DCA Entrance. Longtime parkgoers know about this one. I myself have been going since I was about 4 years old. Not because I was rich, but because my mom worked there. Now because I went so many times as a kid, I, along with many other kids, remember the big California lettering and the postcard look of the original Disneyland California Adventure entrance. It's important to note that California Adventure was not always the park that you know today. The park we know today is a giant mashup of everyone's favorite characters and hobbies. Going into the park today, you can go soaring over California, ride the Incredicoaster, help Rocket rescue the Guardians of the Galaxy, learn to draw your favorite characters, and hell, you can even go buy a beer and listen to live music. But The old Disneyland California Adventure was a completely different atmosphere and environment. People always wonder why it's called California Adventure, and it's because the name stems from the forgotten purpose. The purpose of the park was to capture tourist attractions and high points in the history of the state of California. Now this was a hit or miss for park guests, as you either saw this and thought it was a charming idealistic version of California, or you just thought it was straight up tacky. The original entrance is a telltale sign of that. You had the big letters spelling California in the front that everyone loved to sit on or play around, with two huge ceramic mosaics on either side with the Golden Gate Bridge in the middle. Which, by the way, at the time, this was in fact the largest ceramic mural in the entire world. The park itself had many other references to California, such as the Hollywood area of the park, the Golden Gate Bridge, and even when you first walked in and were treated to a view of the sun icon, which sat under a wave fountain. The obvious symbolism here was the sun for California's usual sunny weather, with the wave fountain representing the abundance of beaches that a lot of people frequent. The original DCA entrance was themed to look like a postcard. In fact, if you stood far enough away from the entrance, it looked as though the sun was setting on a nice day in California, with the sunset peering behind the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, as neat as this was, the atmosphere and overall theming just never hit home for many guests. It was for this reason that there was a major overhaul of reworking the California Adventure Park, with one of the last major changes being to the front entrance in 2011. The debut of Buena Vista Street just a year later is what we see in the park today. Buena Vista Street, along with the redesigning of the front entrance, was meant to resemble Walt Disney's first experience stepping into 1920s Los Angeles. Now, for those too young to remember, or those unfortunate enough to not be able to see the big letters for yourself, don't be too upset, as you can actually visit the letters as they were meant to be seen in person. The letters remain standing at Cal Expo in Sacramento, California, and serve as a part of the main entrance to this event. So if you ever want to get some real Disney nostalgia, you know exactly where to go. I recall it feeling like an empty shell with not much to do, but after attractions like Toy Story Mania and the World of Color came out, the park began to see a real change in vibe and overall experience. Soundsational Parade. Mickey's Soundsational Parade premiered on May 27, 2011 at the Disneyland Resort. The parade was meant as a celebration of music and color, with the floats all themed around music. The full parade had characters from a wide variety of Disney films. Leading the march was Mickey Mouse playing drums and cymbals on a large float, while also directing a group of 6 snare drummers at the front of the parade. Then you had other floats like Aladdin and Simba, who both sat atop drum-shaped floats. Other performances included a float themed around Tiana's New Orleans from The Princess and the Frog, and another float built to look like Rapunzel's tower, which featured Snow White, Cinderella, Aurora, Belle, and obviously Rapunzel. There were many others in the show as well, but those were the characters I feel like most people would know right off the bat. This parade is one of the few parades at Disneyland that actually had a daytime and a nighttime run. However, the nighttime run was put on a hiatus during the Disneyland 60th anniversary celebration in 2016. The parade that would replace this was called the Paint the Night Parade. The Soundsational Parade wouldn't see the light of day for nearly 3 years. Within those 3 years, a lot of parades came and went. This was because after the Paint the Night Parade came out, Disney decided to scrap it altogether in place of another already more established parade that you should all know about now, the Main Street Electrical Parade. The Electrical Parade would come back in 2017, replacing the Paint the Night Parade. And after the Electrical Parade was finished performing later that same year, the original Soundsational Parade was still not allowed to come back and was put on the back burner in light of Disneyland's Pixar Fest. It was only when the Pixar Fest finished in September of 2018 that Disney would bring back the original Soundsational Parade later that year. The Soundsational Parade would eventually be replaced yet again in July 17th of 2019, that parade being Mickey and Friends' Bandtastic Cavalcade. Don't feel too bad if you did not get a chance to see the original Soundsational Parade, as the performances can still be found online, just like many of the other parades on this list. Captain EO. If you have parents that grew up at Disneyland, or if you yourself are that parent, you should know exactly what Captain EO is. Captain EO was a 3D science fiction film that starred none other than the king of pop himself, Michael Jackson. The film played at the same Magic Eye Theater that everyone knows as the attraction that is right next to Space Mountain. It's one of my personal favorite attractions to go on, as it's a perfect way to just chill for like 20 to 30 minutes in a nice air-conditioned room. Captain EO was the premiere film that debuted along with the Magic Eye Theater. The film itself costed over $23 million to make, but it was accompanied with special effects that went along with the music and film thanks to the Magic Eye Theater. The plot told the story of Captain EO and his ragtag crew on his mission to deliver a gift to the Supreme Leader. They all arrive on the planet that is riddled with rotting twisted metal. The group is captured shortly after arriving and is sentenced to prison and torture by the Supreme Leader. However, Captain EO is not having it. He explains that he can see the hidden beauty within the Supreme Leader and that he brought the key that will allow her to see it. He immediately begins singing the song, "We Are Here to Change the World." Initially, the song is working, but when Captain EO decides to yeet his jacket on the ground, one of the crewmates named Hooter slips and breaks his instrument, which abruptly stops the music. Captain EO gets swarmed until Hooter repairs his instrument. Then, in true Michael Jackson fashion, he performs his heart away and transforms all of the dark slaves and guards into agile dancers that fall into step behind him throughout the entire performance. Finally, Captain EO is able to unlock the beauty within the Supreme Leader, transforming her into a beautiful woman, and also transforms the planet into a beautiful paradise. The film ends with the song "Another Part of Me" playing as Captain EO and his crew triumphantly exit the situation. This is one of those films where you really had to be there to get the full effect. After its initial 11-year run from 1986 to 1997, the attraction did not see the light of day until nearly 13 years later in 2010. It was in this year that it was brought back and with more special effects. I was lucky enough to watch it a few times before it closed in June of 2014. And let me tell you, this attraction was really something. I even bought a pin because of how much I liked it. The music and special effects really made the show stand out, along with the fact that Michael Jackson's performances are honestly just amazing in general. The show was a smash hit both times that it came out. Unfortunately, you can't experience Captain EO the way it was meant to be seen in 4D, but you can find the entire thing on YouTube. I will leave a link below to it for those that want to be hit with some nostalgia or possibly experience it for the first time. It's definitely worth one watch. Luigi's Flying Tires. Luigi's Flying Tires was a bumper car style ride that premiered along with Cars Land at Disney's California Adventure. The ride featured tire-shaped bumper cars that didn't work like your typical bumper car ride. You see, instead of allowing people to control the ride like a regular car, you know, like with a steering wheel and the gas pedal, they thought it would be a great idea to instead blow air at the bottom of the vehicles so you would float air hockey style, with the vehicle acting as the air hockey puck. Now, while on paper this sounds awesome, it does not work in practice at all. If you guys had the displeasure of going on this ride yourself, you know my exact opinion of this ride. For the first year or so that it was out, the ride was always packed, and I'm talking like an hour wait or more. And then when you finally got on the ride, you realized how hard it was to actually steer the damn thing. The way it was supposed to work was you and whoever you went on it with had to lean in the direction that you wanted to go. As you can see from the footage of the ride, many people are putting their hands up and leaning from one direction to another. Now, this was fun for like the first 5 seconds. Once you hit someone though, you just kind of awkwardly sat there for 10 seconds trying to build up momentum to hit someone else. To make matters worse, if you were too light or too heavy, your car would kind of just sit there and spin in circles for the entirety of the ride. That was another issue. The ride was only 2 minutes long. So after the first minute and a half of figuring out how to steer the damn thing, you only had 30 seconds to really enjoy it, which is barely enough time to bump into one single person. Most of the time at the end of the ride, you'd just be exactly where you started, spinning in circles. Now, I feel like Disney knew this ride was absolutely ass cheeks because when the ride initially opened, they actually had giant beach balls that guests were able to hit around while on the ride. Now, that definitely made the ride more fun, but at that point, it's not really the ride that's fun, it's more the fact that you get to hit a giant beach ball. It's similar to how when you're at a baseball game and someone just randomly hits one of those beach balls into the crowd. It makes the experience more enjoyable, sure, but the baseball game didn't do anything to earn that enjoyment. Now, this sounded fine and all, and it was, but after 2 months, the beach balls were removed due to minor accidents that guests complained about after being hit with the beach balls. Not long after, The ride could be found being super barren, with wait times as low as 5 minutes. The ride would only last 3 years until it was eventually replaced by Luigi's Rollickin' Roadsters, which is honestly just another ride meant to keep crowds away from the bigger attractions, but it's definitely a step up from the original ride. Skyway. Skyway is a long forgotten attraction that first premiered at the Disneyland Resort in Southern California. The experience you would get from riding Skyway was the same experience you might get from jumping onto a ski lift. The ride featured these buckets, which if you don't know, are actually called gondolas. Gondola just meaning that it's this type of ski lift cable type of ride. The buckets could only fit 2 people initially, with 2 patio style chairs being bolted into each bucket. With 42 buckets in total, the ride would act as a shuttle from Tomorrowland to Fantasyland, and if you wanted to, you could even go from Fantasyland to Tomorrowland, as the ride had 2 stations to come and go from. Now keep in mind that during this time, Disneyland was still on the ticketed system. If you don't recognize these, basically you would walk into Disneyland and instead of buying a one-size-fits-all ticket that grants you access to every single ride, it was done county fair style, where you would have to buy a booklet of tickets that looked like this. When it came time to decide if you wanted to ride something, you would have to look at what ticket allowed permission onto that ride, and you would tear it out and hand it in order to gain admission to that ride. So knowing this, if you took the Skyway to Fantasyland using one D ticket, the only way to get back to Tomorrowland was to use another D ticket. This is just something that I wanted to point out because I feel like most people forget how much of a pain it really was to ration out your tickets. You couldn't just go on everything freely. Now, as I was saying, the 2 stations could be found in Tomorrowland and Fantasyland. The station in Tomorrowland was called the Skyway to Fantasyland, as if you took it, it would take you directly to Fantasyland. And vice versa, the station in Fantasyland was called the Skyway to Tomorrowland, because obviously it would transport you to Tomorrowland. The ride itself was a big hit amongst guests, and the ride stayed for almost 40 years. During this 40 years, there were several reworks and rebuilds of the ride. During the time the Matterhorn was being built, Skyway was closed because the Matterhorn was to be built smack dab in the middle of the ride. The obvious solution was to just scrap the Skyway ride altogether, but that's not what Walt Disney wanted. Instead, he chose to build the Matterhorn around the Skyway attraction. This actually improved the overall experience, as now the guests that would get onto the Skyway attraction would travel through the Matterhorn bobsleds to see this part where the Yeti would scare the bobsled riders. This further increased popularity among parkgoers. However, it would take nearly 5 years for the Imagineers to figure out how to fit more people on the ride's buckets. Finally, in 1965, the ride reached its max potential when the attraction's original round 2-seater buckets were replaced by these slicker designed rectangular 4-seater buckets. This was made possible by utilizing a lighter material to make the buckets, which allowed for the weight of 2 more people to be added onto each vehicle. The only other incident or rework that took place was during the early 1980s when the Fantasyland renovation was in place. This made it so the Skyway ride would only make round trips from and to Tomorrowland. Disneyland would eventually close the Skyway ride on November 9th of 1994. At the time, the closure is said to have been because of the declining popularity of the ride, and also because they needed the workers that ran the Skyway attraction to work on the then upcoming Indiana Jones attraction that would open nearly a year later. There was also another rumor that went around explaining how one of the bucket seats fell 30 feet below, but this was proven to be not the exact story, and charges from the man claiming the incident were quickly dropped. Unlike the PeopleMover incident, this ride's remnants were removed from the park, but the Fantasyland station actually remained all the way until 2016. Later in 2016, Disney finally ordered for the destruction of the original Skyway building, leaving this experience to remain in the minds of those lucky enough to ride the Skyway attraction. If you are one of those lucky few who were able to get on this ride before it was closed, comment below with your own personal experience. A Bug's Land. A Bug's Land was the original land that connected Hollywoodland and Cars Land. The debut of Bug's Land was a critical part in the success of Disneyland's California Adventure. A Bug's Land was brought to California Adventure during its time of hardship. Before the debut, the park was actually losing money every day because of its lack of attractions. You see, back then in 2001, There wasn't any real reason for a family to go to California Adventure, as there weren't really any attractions that were geared towards younger kids. While in complete contrast, Disneyland had a plethora of everything from dark rides to less intense thrill attractions. This is where A Bug's Land came in. A Bug's Land was the saving grace that paved way for more creative attractions and lands to come to California Adventure, and it's honestly the reason we have the rides that we see there today. The inspiration for the land came from the original It's Tough to Be a Bug show. This attraction, being basically one of the only attractions for younger audiences, was a huge success, and because of this, Disney decided to open an entire Bug's Land. The park debuted in October of 2002 with 5 new attractions. These 5 attractions were mostly well received by its target audience, but it still got a lot of hate from other park goers. Mostly for the same reasons that the entire park at the time was getting hate, because of its use of generic rides. For example, Tuck and Roll's Drive-'n Buggies was a simple reskin of just a normal bumper car ride. Flik's Flyers was a generic swing attraction, Heimlich's Choo Choo Train was a lazy, uneventful train ride, and Francis Ladybug Boogie was simply a Teacups knockoff. Now, when looking at this attraction through a more cynical lens like this, it's clear that it was a pretty cost-effective attempt at bringing in more ticket sales. However, you have to give props to Disney, as this land did exactly what it was supposed to do. It brought in a ton more people and is the biggest factor in California Adventure being able to become what it is today. Sadly, A Bug's Land was announced to be closing in 2018 in lieu of the new Avengers Land. It officially closed on September 4th of 2018 and will be remembered by many. I personally don't take too fondly to it, and to be quite frank, I didn't even realize it was supposed to be its own themed land. I thought it was just a really cool Bug's Land themed area that was a nice shortcut to the Tower of Terror and the Hyperion Theater. The land truly was a hit or miss for most people, but as of today, it's been completely gutted, with some of the attractions being used in other parts of the DCA park. For example, Flik's Flyers was actually rethemed and reworked as the Inside Out Emotional Whirlwind ride that is located at the Pixar Pier. It is stipulated that some of the other attractions have been donated or sold to collectors, but not much information is known about the whereabouts of these attractions. What we do know about is that A Bug's Land will be remembered by those who were lucky enough to walk through it and really feel what it's like to be as small as a bug. This will bring us to Layer 3. Layer 3 goes over attractions that still technically exist, but they are either rethemed versions of the ride or they exist at another Disneyland park. But I'd say for the most part, these rides were Disney's attempts at recapturing the magic. Previous Autopia versions. So, we know Autopia as being that one ride that everybody wanted to get on as a kid, only to realize how freaking hard it was to steer these damn things. The Autopia we see today at the Disneyland Resort was not the only version that has existed. In fact, there were actually 4 other versions of the ride. There was the original Tomorrowland Autopia, Junior Autopia, Midget Autopia, and Fantasyland Autopia. Just to preface this part so there's no misunderstanding, the original Autopia that opened in 1955 is not the same track you guys see today. What you guys see today is the revamped version of the ride. The original Tomorrowland Autopia that premiered in 1955 featured a much smaller track than what we see today, as the one that we see today goes around Tomorrowland and Fantasyland. But the one in 1955 took guests on a route that went through only Tomorrowland, not Fantasyland. The initial success of the Autopia ride led to a big problem: the wait times and the lines. The lines became such a huge problem that Autopia's line began to clog up majority of Tomorrowland. The solution to this problem came in the form of another ride, Junior Autopia. Now, the Junior Autopia opened in Fantasyland in 1956. This ride was the exact same experience you would get from going on the Tomorrowland variant, with one big difference. The Junior Autopia had a center guardrail to prevent accidents when driving. The reason this one opened was because of how packed the lines got for the original Autopia in Tomorrowland. Disney put this one out just to get lines down on the original Autopia in Tomorrowland. Disney wanted to make another Autopia ride in another separate land of the park in an effort to lure guests away from the original ride. Junior Autopia was initially a very big hit with guests. Because of this ride's initial success, Disney decided to revamp the ride to make it even better. They closed the ride in 1958 and reopened it under the name Fantasyland Autopia, obviously taking inspiration from the fact that it was in Fantasyland to begin with. Both Junior Autopia and Fantasyland Autopia were essentially the same exact ride, only this time, the Fantasyland variant was almost a complete duplicate of the Tomorrowland version, featuring the exact same theming and track layout as the original. In the year 2000, Disney announced a partnership with Chevron, and as a result, they scrapped both the Fantasyland and Tomorrowland Autopia in order to make a giant track for Autopia that went through both lands. This track is what we see today. Now, aside from those other 3 versions, there was one version that didn't last long called Midget Autopia. Midget Autopia was the kids' version of the ride. I know you're scratching your head because you probably thought that the original Autopia was made with the intention of only having kids in the driving vehicles, but that's not true. As you can see today, the ride was made for kids and adults to enjoy. The same cannot be said for the Midget version of the ride. Midget Autopia was a shrunken down version of the original Autopia, with the cars only being able to fit 2 small children in them at most. This attraction was located at the very edge of Fantasyland. It opened in 1957 but was quickly closed 9 years later in 1966. It was closed to make room for the ride It's a Small World. The ride featured the same style of track with a guardrail in the middle and much smaller vehicles. To be quite honest, it kind of sucks that It's a Small World replaced this ride because I'm sure that kids nowadays would much rather go on this Autopia ride than the 5-minute snooze fest that is It's a Small World. Because honestly, who gets on It's a Small World to look at the scenery? I feel like this ride has always been the ultimate nap ride. Let me know in the comments if you guys also agree with this, and if you guys also went on any of the initial versions of Autopia. Muppet Vision 3D. Muppet Vision 3D is a film attraction that was shown off in the same style of Captain EO, in that you would have to wear these 3D glasses to watch it, and it was set inside of a big theater. The original attraction was located at California Adventure. The show had 2 main parts, the pre-show and the main show. The pre-show would start when you were in line for the attraction, as the queue for the ride acted as the backstage for the show. You would frequently see these monitors hanging everywhere on site, capturing glimpses of the Muppets frantically preparing for the experience that you were about to enjoy. Once you got inside the theater, guests were treated to a spotlight fixated on a balcony. The light revealed the Muppets, Statler and Waldorf, who would crack a few jokes, tell you the safety precautions and whatnot, and then the curtains would open and the show would start. The show itself was supposed to be Kermit the Frog taking the viewer through the Muppets' discovery of 3D technology. The show starts off with the promise of not showing any cheap 3D tricks, but that's not really kept up, as literally the next second they have a bunch of cheap 3D gags. There's a bit more nuance to the show, but I will leave a link below to anyone that wants to experience it for themselves. I don't want to spoil anything, so let's move on. Flik's Flyers / It's Tough to Be a Bug Show. Both of these attractions were part of the aforementioned Bugs Land. Flik's Flyers was a simple fair style ride. I will say I love the original design of this ride, as it looked like you were sitting inside regular everyday items. Only now, those regular everyday items were humongous. For example, there was a big Chinese food box and also kids snack boxes. The ride premiered along with other rides as part of the opening of A Bug's Land. Unfortunately, the ride would not last as the land would close. However, Flik's Flyers can still be enjoyed today, as it was reworked into Inside Out's Emotional Whirlwind. This ride is almost the exact same ride minus the aesthetics. Another attraction that was lost with the closure of A Bug's Land was the It's Tough to Be a Bug Show. This was the more prominent attraction of this forgotten land, as it's the original attraction that led to the development of A Bug's Land. The queue to the ride would take you underground into a dark cavern. Now, to be quite honest, the scenery for the show was actually really cool, and I wish I had gone to see it before it closed. Because just look at it. If A Bug's Land did one thing right, it really did make you feel as small as a bug. The film itself used theater lighting, 3D glasses, animatronics, and a lot of other special effects. The show was actually pretty short, running at only 9 minutes long. But there was actually a lot packed into those 9 minutes. As you grabbed your bug eyes and got seated to watch the show, it would begin with Flik appearing above the screen, explaining some facts about bugs. The show begins with demonstrations of fun facts about bugs and later takes a darker, scarier turn when Hopper appears. He takes notice of the audience and declares that humans are bugs' biggest enemies. This is where the show gets most of its shock factor, as you get sprayed with liquid and then poked by the seat you are sitting on. I myself found this to be very unpleasant, but going a second time is way more fun as you get to see everyone's first time reaction to them getting their butt poked. The show ends on a happy note explaining how the world needs bugs. If you want to experience the show yourself, the show still exists today in Walt Disney World. Let me know your own personal experience with the It's Tough to Be a Bug show in the comments. Moving on. Paradise Pier. Paradise Pier premiered in February of 2001 along with the opening of Disney's California Adventure. Paradise Pier technically still remains at the park today, only now it has been reskinned and renamed to be Pixar Pier. Although it was called a pier, it's more like a waterside area of the park. The pier had the same rides we know today and grew through the years that it was there. The first of many rides to come to Paradise Pier was California Screamin', which we now know today as the Incredicoaster. By the way, before we move on, who else loved California Screamin' better than the Incredicoaster? Because how can you not fall in love with this sound?
And away you go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1!
Like this video if you're with me on this one. Then, in 2008, we got Toy Story Mania. We also had the Sun Wheel, which was just a glorified Ferris wheel. This Ferris wheel has actually gone through many changes itself. It went from the Sun Wheel to Mickey's Fun Wheel, and now is known as Pixar's Pal Around. Later in 2010, we would see the introduction of many other rides, most notably the World of Color, Silly Symphony Swings, Goofy Sky School, and finally the last addition at the time, which was the Little Mermaid ride, Ariel's Undersea Adventure. All of these rides are still there today at Pixar Pier. Some of them, as stated before, have had their names changed. The original Paradise Pier also had these really lovely posters everywhere. The best part of the walk was after crossing the bridge to get to where California Screamin' and Toy Story Mania was. The scenery that was found here was very much California, with the posters, billboards, and shops all being themed around the sunny weather that California is known for. I personally love the original Paradise Pier more so than the Pixar Pier that we have today. Mulholland Madness. Mulholland Madness was the original roller coaster in the far corner of Paradise Pier. Today we see this coaster as Goofy Sky School, but when a California Adventure premiered in 2001 with Paradise Pier, Mulholland Madness was the original name and theme of this ride. The coaster uses the same exact track as Goofy Sky School. The biggest differences here are in the appearance of the ride. Mulholland Madness was based off of the famous road in Hollywood known as Mulholland Drive. This road was named after the Los Angeles civil engineer William Mulholland, and the road itself is very well known to have extensive views of Hollywood. There is even a few points on this road where there are designated locations to stop so one can see the view. Mulholland Madness, however, didn't really try to capture these scenic views that the road was known for. Instead, they opted for a more fast-paced version which matched the frequent turns and speed of what it would be like to drive through Mulholland Drive. The scenery, if you can really call it that, was just a few billboards here and there with a fuck ton of caution signs everywhere. To be fair though, I think the ride was actually really hard to theme because of the location and the size of the ride. Also, the fact that it was outside meant that it was really hard to give that Mulholland Drive feel, as it meant you'd have to change everything around the ride to look like Mulholland Drive, and obviously that would be pretty expensive and redundant. Also, just on a side note, apparently there were 3 accidents that came about on Mulholland Madness, but there's not much information that can be found on them besides from this newspaper, which outright states that there were 3 accidents. These accidents, however, did not lead to them changing the ride to Goofy Sky School, as this article states the accidents were in 2001 and Mulholland Madness wouldn't close until 2010. I think it was for the best that Mulholland Madness would close for Goofy Sky School, because Goofy Sky School does a better job with the theming and overall color scheme. I love going on Goofy Sky School and most likely would have loved the earlier version of the ride if I ever went on it. Swiss Family Treehouse. So this one actually took me by surprise. I didn't even know this was a thing, as I always believed that the attraction that sits there today was the original. So in November 18th, 1962, a treehouse attraction aptly named the Swiss Family Treehouse premiered in Adventureland. The treehouse was based on a movie that came out in the 1960s titled Swiss Family Robinson. If you haven't seen the movie, basically a Swiss family is relocating elsewhere via a ship, but then they get attacked by pirates. The crew that was on board abandoned the ship, leaving the family to fend for themselves. Eventually, the ship lands them on an uninhabited island. The family then decides to construct an elaborate treehouse in order to provide apt safety and comfort. This is where the inspiration for this attraction came from. This attraction is one of the few walk-through attractions, which basically means instead of sitting down on some vehicle or mechanism, you physically have to walk through the attraction to get the full experience. The attraction showcased many iconic parts from the movie, such as the complex water wheel that the family made, the treehouse rooms taken from the movie, and also gave you a nice view of Adventureland from atop of the treehouse. When this ride opened in 1962, it initially required a C ticket, and if you watched my last video, you should know these tiers. The funny thing about this ride is that it's one of the few rides that got demoted from one ticket tier to a lower ticket tier. This attraction going from a C tier ticket to a B tier ticket in 1966. Just so everyone is aware, the way the tiers worked was E as the best tier, then D tier, C tier, B tier, and lastly A tier, which had the least popular rides. The ride stayed at Disneyland for quite some time, but unfortunately for the Swiss family, the ride would change in 1999 to what we now see today as Tarzan's Treehouse. I always thought from a young age that the attraction was always originally Tarzan's Treehouse and never knew about this Swiss family ride. If you want to see the original attraction in all of its glory, it's still a public attraction at a few of the Disney parks around the world. It can be seen at the Magic Kingdom in Walt Disney World, Tokyo Disneyland, and Disneyland Paris. If you got a chance to see this ride in person, leave a comment below sharing your personal experience. Moving on. General Electric's Carousel of Progress. General Electric's Carousel of Progress was brought to Tomorrowland in July 2nd of 1967. Now the ride has an interesting history that I wanted to touch on beforehand. As you can tell, General Electric sponsored this ride, which isn't too weird as Disney has always had sponsorships, like with the Autopia ride and the PeopleMover. However, the Carousel of Progress was not the original ride that General Electric wanted. General Electric and Walt Disney got together to draw up a brand new land called Edison Square. The land was originally drawn up as part of an expansion to Main Street, USA. The expansion was to feature two districts. One district called International Street, which would have been regular old Main Street renamed, and a new section called Edison Square. Edison Square was to have rides all themed around electricity, with General Electric as the sponsor. The signature attraction was to be called General Electric's Harnessing the Lightning, which was to feature a cast of animatronics telling the story and advancement of technology. Unfortunately, this project was scrapped due to General Electric facing a lot of legal action and damage to its reputation at the time. In an effort to restore their reputation, GE reached out to Walt Disney once again, only this time it was to develop a show for the company's pavilion at the 1964 New York World's Fair. Disney obviously jumped at this chance, and now we have what we know today as the Carousel of Progress. So this ride actually did not originally premiere at Disneyland. It instead premiered at the 1964 New York World's Fair. The original Carousel of Progress at the New York's World Fair was such a big hit that the next year it was brought back and was given its own massive covered queue on an empty lot in order to protect visitors from New York's hot summer sun. Because of the huge success, Disney actually brought the attraction to Disneyland on July 2nd of 1967 as a part of the new Tomorrowland. Now enough with history, what was the actual experience like? The ride gained a lot of success because of its unique way of telling its story. Instead of being on a vehicle that moved you through the ride, it felt as though the ride was moving around you. You would walk inside a 200-seat theater and sit down for the attraction. Once inside, The show would start with its first act. Each act following would spin their way into view. The ride was split into 5 scenes in this circular formation, with the first scene starting just before the 1900s, with each progressing act taking place further and further into the future. It took you through the dawn of the 1900s, the 1920s, the 1940s, and then it would take you into some unspecified time beyond 1967, which was the original debut year of the ride. Finally, the ride would end with you in Progress City. Now, the coolest thing about the ride aside from the show was that once you exited, you could take a ramp up to a second floor, and on this second floor you were given an up close and personal view of the animated moving Epcot Center. At the time, the only way to see this Epcot Center was on the PeopleMover, but thanks to the Carousel of Progress, you can now view it in all of its glory up close. The reason this ride closed was because of General Electric. GE surveyed the ride goers of the Carousel of Progress and found that almost everyone on the ride was local Anaheim residents and returning park goers. Obviously to them, this was bad marketing, as showing the same person the same product isn't going to make you that much money. They approached Disney with the idea to move the ride to their new Magic Kingdom in Florida. This was done to gain new exposure to a new audience. In 1973, the Carousel of Progress was closed and replaced by a new show, America Sings. But I won't get into that show here because that's a bit further down on the iceberg. Star Tours. So if you go to Tomorrowland often, then this entry might confuse you, as you should know that Star Tours is still up and running. But what you might not know is that what you see today is actually a rendition of Star Tours called Star Tours The Adventures Continue. The original name, which was just simply Star Tours, was a much more tame and less cool version than what we see today. The original ride had a soft opening with limited guests being invited to ride it in 1986, with the official opening happening later the next year in January 9th of 1987. This ride was widely anticipated as it had a lot of hype leading up to it, as Star Wars is obviously massively popular. The original idea for Star Tours came from these flight simulators, which were shown to Disney Imagineers in hopes of them using it for an attraction. Even though at the time, the simulators gave Imagineers motion sickness because of the mismatched visuals of the ride, the Imagineers loved the concept and kept it in the back of their minds. Eventually, George Lucas would be approached by Disney to make a Star Wars themed ride using these flight simulators. Lucas loved the idea and signed off almost immediately. Then it was time to put the ride in action. Instead of creating a whole new ride, Disney decided to get rid of the Adventure Through Inner Space ride at Tomorrowland and put the new Star Tours ride there. This was actually the hardest part at the time because this meant that the flight simulators had to be lowered in from above the show building. Any small snap or mishap would destroy the $500,000 ride vehicles. Even harder than constructing the actual ride and the building theme was the production of the film that would play in each vehicle. You have to keep in mind that at the time, CGI was in its baby phase. So what this meant was that the production team had to shoot the film the same way that the Star Wars films were made, by filming with small miniature set pieces. However, because the ride was supposed to be one big long shot, this meant that they couldn't film exactly like they did for the movies, with lots of cuts being thrown in. They had to film the ride in one long take. Individuals involved in this process explained that it was way more challenging and complex than shooting the original Star Wars movies. Once the ride was finished, the ride finally premiered, and in Disney fashion, the wait times were longer than ever. I mean, just take a look at this picture. This isn't just a random crowd at Disneyland. This is the actual line for the ride. Queues for the ride are said to have stretched all the way down to Main Street, and rightfully so, as stepping inside the building calmed your doubt on whether the ride would be worth the wait. The inside of the building was designed to look like a droid repair shop. There was supposed to be more animatronics, but due to budget cuts, Imagineers began taking animatronics from other rides and using their endoskeletons as props. A notable example was this quadruplet of birds from the America Sings ride being downsized to a trio, as one of the birds was stripped to its endoskeleton and used in its animatronic form in this ride. This became more apparent if you took a look at its feet. Funny enough, this is actually still in the ride to this day. If you guys go to Star Tours nowadays, I just went last week to Disneyland, you can still see this webbed feet endoskeleton in the queue to this day. Once you're done waiting in line, you actually get to go inside the ride. Now, getting inside the ride vehicle is basically the same. You wait for the doors to open with a video playing and then you board. Now, there are some major differences between this version of Star Tours and the new version of Star Tours. The new version of Star Tours has 54 different variations, while the original Star Tours only had one. And instead of being led by C-3PO, it was led by a robot simply named Rex. Once the ride began, Rex would explain that you will be getting a tour of the planet Endor, but unfortunately, Rex wasn't that competent as he quickly gets the riders into dangerous situations. The ride has multiple situations where you get out of danger and then are thrown back into it, and then you get back into danger again, and it just repeats itself over and over again. Eventually, you get to the ride's most iconic scene, joining the Rebel Alliance and taking down the Death Star, which, by the way, makes no sense in the context of the movie as the events of this ride technically take place after Return of the Jedi, but I guess Disney just ignored continuity because who the fuck cares? The ride would finally come to an end with one last thrill where you almost collide with a fuel truck. I admit, I do have some invaluable nostalgia when it comes to the original ride, but obviously the new Star Tours version is not even comparable. It's so much better with the 3D glasses and the cool twist at the beginning of each ride, which I don't want to spoil here if you have not ridden it yourself. But if you know, you know. I will say that I found it a bit underwhelming towards the end of its lifespan, but it still holds a special place in my heart as one of my favorite rides of all time. Country Bear Jamboree. Country Bear Jamboree opened in Disneyland in 1972. It was the centerpiece to the newest land known as Bear Country. The ride was a complete clone of the Walt Disney World variant with almost no difference in the two rides. Crazy enough, to get on the ride, you would actually need an e-ticket. The experience was just a simple show presentation. You would sit down in a theater and just watch these lifelike country bears play old country songs. A fun fact about this project was that much like the Carousel of Progress, this attraction was planned to be part of an entirely different project before being brought to any Disneyland park. The origins of the Country Bears dates back to a forgotten Disney project in the 1960s for a ski resort in Mineral King Valley. Walt Disney wanted his ski resort to include some entertainment, and so the Country Bear Jamboree attraction was born. Unfortunately, Walt's death in 1966 meant that this idea would never pan out, but the concept for the show would live on as it was brought to the Magic Kingdom shortly after. Then Disneyland would follow in its footsteps and bring it there in 1972. The ride was closed in September of 2001 to make way for the many adventures of Winnie the Pooh, which is still going on in the theme park today. Tower of Terror. The Tower of Terror is an absolute classic amongst Disney park goers. How could you not love the feeling of driving to Disneyland and know that you were getting close because you could see the Tower of Terror peering over the entire skyline? The Tower of Terror premiered at Disneyland's California Adventure on May 5th of 2004. It was placed in the corner of Hollywoodland where the building remains to this day. The original ride was based on the Twilight Zone, with the ride being aptly named the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror. Walking up and going inside this ride was completely daunting if you didn't know what to expect. The outdoor queue starts with 1930s jazz music as you make your way through the rotten and overgrown gardens. Passing through the hotel's front door, you get the sense that this hotel hasn't been touched since its closure, with dust and cobwebs being littered everywhere throughout the attraction. Guests were ushered into the hotel library with bellhops of the hotel, informing them that their rooms just weren't ready yet. Everyone that worked this ride always had the same gloomy feel, which honestly made the ride feel so much scarier. It felt as if you had really entered this dark hotel. Once inside the library, the power goes out and then a video would play explaining how one fateful night, a lightning storm hits the elevators, which caused 5 people to mysteriously vanish from the premises. The television then turns off, and guests are directed through to the boiler room. The elevator opens and you get on the ride. The ride would start off very dark with a narrator explaining how you have now entered the Twilight Zone. The ride vehicle would move around to another area. Suddenly, you'd be taken up to the next floor. This time, the narrator talks about what happened to those aforementioned 5 people. Following this was more spooky narration about how your group is the next to die. Then the ride would jump you up and down freefall style and famously take you up to the top where you get a wonderful view of California Adventure, ending with you dropping completely to the bottom back to where you started. The narrator would end the ride off stating how you should be more careful when choosing what hotel to stay with. If you got a chance to ride the Tower of Terror, you know how freaking awesome it was. The set design and the overall ride experience was just unmatched by everything else in California Adventure. Nowadays, the ride has been changed into Guardians of the Galaxy Mission Breakout, which is just a breathtaking building to see in person. But I honestly still miss the old Tower of Terror. It's definitely my nostalgia saying this, but the Tower of Terror never failed to give me chills. Thankfully, the new ride does hold up immensely well and even got the Star Tours treatment, having 6 different drop sequences on the ride. So each time you get on it, you are likely to have a different experience. Comment below if you share the same nostalgia as me with the old Tower of Terror. Moving on. Disneyland, the first 50 magical years. I'm sure you all remember that one building on Main Street that says, "Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln," the big building with the red sign. Well, for a brief period of time, from May 5th, 2005 to March 15th of 2009, the film was actually replaced with another film simply called Disneyland, the first 50 magical years. The feature was shown in the Opera House Theater. It featured Donald Duck and actor Steve Martin. I believe Steve Martin was chosen to shoot this as he had a personal experience with the Disneyland park, having worked at Merlin's Magic Shop around the late 1950s. The film's runtime was around 17 minutes and took the viewer on a journey through Disneyland's history and how it's changed throughout the years, showing the viewer the land that Disneyland was built on before and after its creations, explaining how Walt's vision for the Disneyland resort came to fruition in just 1 year. The film was brought on board in light of Disneyland's 50th anniversary celebration in 2005. It would only last 4 years and was closed in 2009 to make way for the return of Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. I believe this film is still actually intact and is shown on a nearby television in the Opera House Theater. I may be wrong about this last part, but I'm pretty sure I've gone in there myself and seen this film being played on a loop. If you guys haven't seen the film, I will leave a link below as it's a pretty good history film on how Disneyland was built. This will bring us to Layer 4, which has a lot of attractions that cannot be enjoyed at the park, but they do have some remnants or references that can be seen in the park to this day. This layer seems to encapsulate the classic Disneyland. Innoventions. I've mentioned this entry before in parts 1 and 2. This entry on the iceberg is what replaced the America Sings attraction at the rotating theater in Tomorrowland. The Innovention Center saw its official opening date on November 10th, 1998. So I have a personal beef with Disneyland for getting rid of this attraction. I absolutely adored the Innovention Center growing up, and ever since I discovered it when I was 5, I'd always beg my family to go inside. Now there was 2 versions of the Innovention Center that I can recall from going inside myself. There was one version that started off with an animatronic being voiced by Tom Morrow, where you would enter through a spinning platform. Once aboard, 2 pre-shows would occur, and once they ended, you were brought inside the actual Innovention Center. I keep calling it the Innovention Center because that's what it was, a center for so-called innoventions, which is a play on words for innovation inventions. There was another version of the entrance which got rid of the entire pre-show and simply allowed you to walk inside of the building immediately. Once inside though, it was the coolest thing ever. There was dozens of gaming systems, VR style rides, light up carpet style video games, driving games with real feedback, an actual Iron Man suit simulation, and just all kinds of fun gadgets and gizmos for people to enjoy. It really was what I believed a center like this should have been, a center full of the latest and cutting edge technology all in one spot. There was also IKEA style rooms where you could see how houses would look in the future. One of my favorite parts was answering this questionnaire thing where it would tell you what your future would look like. Any Disney fan would have loved going inside the center, and I can't imagine the reasoning behind the closure. There was so much to enjoy once you got inside. The thing that sucked most about the entire attraction was that the outside of the building did not do justice for what was inside the building. There was so much to offer, but sadly, like most things, it came to an end. In 2015, Disney would redesign the entire Innoventions attraction into a basic character meet and greet location, but this also wouldn't last. It was named Superhero HQ, and at the time, it was decent. The scenery was pretty immersive and all, but I can never shake the feeling that I missed the old Innovention Center. This didn't last too long either, as in 2016 it was changed yet again to a Star Wars theme, this time being named the Star Wars Launch Bay, which did a better job at making the entire experience more enjoyable, but still, I don't understand why Disney didn't just keep the original center the way it was and keep adding more and more technology. I can only imagine how cool it would have been to have HTC Vives and full-size VR attractions in there. I think this building's use peaked in 2010 at the height of the Innovention Center hype. Moving on. Submarine Voyage. Submarine Voyage was the original ride that was in Tomorrowland. Nowadays, we see the Finding Nemo Submarine Voyage ride, but the original ride was just a general deep-sea diving ride. It came to be on June 14th, 1959 with a vehicle capacity of 39 people, which is a weird number of people to have on a ride, but anyways, the ride vehicles looked like basic nautical transport with no real theming going on. To be quite honest, I've been going to Disneyland since I was 4 years old, and I never once realized that this was a ride until the Finding Nemo version came out. That's just how empty the ride usually was. It looked pretty boring on the outside and wasn't really all too exciting. That's just my personal opinion though from looking on the outside. However, I could not be more wrong, as the ride itself was very immersive. The ride began with the ride vehicle being lowered into the depths of the lagoon. Here, guests would see various creatures and life forms, which included giant sea bass, sea turtles, lobsters, clams, and all sorts of sea life. The narrator voicing everything would then announce that a storm was coming, so to avoid it, you'd have to go deeper into the ocean. The submarine would then dive very deep into the ocean. What was actually happening in reality was the submarine was entering a show building, which helped add to the illusion, but nonetheless, when you were inside the show building, you could see a giant squid, color-changing fish, and even mermaids. Down here was long-lost Atlantis statues, and then you'd see a long, cross-eyed sea serpent. After this, the submarine would come back up to land and you'd get off the ride. I personally wish they would have kept this version of the ride because it seemed a lot more realistic and creepy than what we have nowadays. The cool thing about the Submarine Voyage was their use of practical effects to really sell the illusion that you were diving deeper into the ocean. One example was this technique of blowing bubbles at this angle to give the illusion that you were diving deeper, while in tandem with this, you'd enter the showroom building, which made everything naturally darker. This really made people feel like it wasn't a ride, but that you were actually going very deep underwater. Starcade. The Starcade was an arcade that could be found in between the line for Space Mountain and Star Tours. It was a small entrance with a sign that read Starcade on the front. The initial opening date for the Starcade was on May 27th, 1977. It premiered alongside with Space Mountain as part of a new section of Tomorrowland opening up. Not much footage remains from the early years of the Starcade besides what I'm showing on screen. The Starcade was nothing more than your average arcade. There was some Star Wars theming initially, with a large X-Wing starfighter being hung from the ceiling and the lights on top resembling stars in the galaxy, but besides that, there wasn't too much connection with Star Wars. The entire arcade was initially 2 levels, but for some unknown reason, the second level was closed off starting in the late 1990s. If you went to Disneyland before the closure of the Starcade, then you know about these infamous escalators. I have been to the Starcade since I was about 4 years old, and I've always noticed the escalators were blocked off. I always thought it was just a big coincidence that every time I came, the top floor was closed off. But apparently, there was more games and space to play up top, but was seemingly closed off without an answer as to why. This blockage would remain in front of the escalators for the remainder of the Starcade's life. Crazy enough, the top level was used for a brief period of time to house the arcade machines from the Flynn's Arcade, which is another entry down further on the iceberg. Now, like the Innovention Center, I love this arcade and it holds a special place in my heart. I used to love when I'd get off Space Mountain and head to this arcade to waste some time. The games inside never changed for the most part. It was usually riddled with retro arcade games from the 70s and the 80s. You had your usual Pac-Man, Galaga, and Centipede, but this would change in 2012 when Wreck-It Ralph was released. This was when the Starcade started bringing in new machines, and at one point had a playable version of the Wreck-It Ralph game that was free to play. It would have been really freaking cool if they made this section into the arcade from Wreck-It Ralph, which is what I thought they were going to go for, but they never went full force on with it. If you had an annual pass to Disneyland, this attraction was definitely something you could be seen frequently enjoying. After a while, you'd get tired of going on these same rides all the time, and that's where the Starcade came in. Blowing off some steam inside this arcade was a wonderful feat. While at the end of the day it's just an average arcade, I think the fact that it was inside Disneyland just made it so much more enjoyable, because whenever you were finished playing games, you could now go enjoy some more awesome Disney rides. Unfortunately for the Starcade, it would come to a close in 2015 where it ceased its function as an arcade. Following the closure, in the year 2017, the Starcade could be seen being used as a welcome center for annual pass holders. Then, later in 2018, the Starcade was no longer accessible to regular park guests, and the only way for anyone to enjoy this arcade space was to rent the space out, as the Starcade was now used as a private event space for corporate functions, with the upper level being converted into an extension of Space Mountain's queue. Funny enough, the space that housed this arcade is still called the Starcade, and to my knowledge, it still has the same exact sign up and running as if the arcade is running business as usual. Rocket Jets. Rocket Jets premiered along with the new Tomorrowland in 1967. This attraction could be found sitting above the former PeopleMover station. This big observatory thing with rockets circulating around it was actually a ride that anyone could get on. You might be scratching your head wondering how you would even get in line for this ride, as it was on top of another ride. Now, I don't know if this is the only time Disney has ever done something like this, but you would have to take a regular average elevator to get on this ride. This seems very un-Disney to me, because even when rides require you to get onto an elevator, they try to somehow theme it. Much like in the Haunted Mansion, where they play a little show in the elevator so you guys don't realize that you're inside of an elevator going down to a lower floor. In complete contrast, the Rocket Jets elevator is just a normal open screen elevator. Once you get on the ride, it's just a very simple swing attraction. Now, if you are looking at this ride thinking, hey, that looks like the big observatory thing that sits at the entrance to Tomorrowland, you are exactly right, because what you're looking at is the original Rocket Jets ride reskinned and rebuilt to appear different. In 1997, the new Tomorrowland renovation would move the Rocket Jets attraction and place it down below where guests could actually walk to the line. Renaming the ride to be the Astro Orbiter, this attraction remains in the park to this day as a main attraction that you can see before walking into Tomorrowland. And honestly, I think this was a good move on Disney's part, as it definitely makes Tomorrowland appear a lot more futuristic and iconic. I will say though, part of the thrill of this ride was lost. The slogan for the original Rocket Jets was to be high in the sky, with the ride being quite literally higher in the sky than any of the other attractions. Classic Fantasyland. Classic Fantasyland refers to the original Fantasyland that premiered at the Disneyland Resort on July 17, 1955. Fantasyland was part of the original concept for Disneyland, as it features the iconic Sleeping Beauty Castle as its front entrance, with a ton of major attractions being taken from the original animated movies. Some of the rides that have been there since the beginning are Peter Pan's Flight, Alice in Wonderland, Dumbo the Flying Elephant, King Arthur's Carousel, the Mad Tea Party, and Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Now, initially the land had a more Renaissance look and feel, but eventually the land would receive a major update in 1983. Transforming itself into a Bavarian village that took inspiration from Pinocchio and is what we see today in the park. There isn't much difference from the original Fantasyland to the one that we see now. The major differences are more so with the rides in the land and not so much the actual land itself. Not much else needs to be said here. Moving on. Monsanto House of the Future. The Monsanto House of the Future was an attraction that premiered in Tomorrowland on June 12th of 1957. The attraction was sponsored by company Monsanto and was built to resemble a concept for future living in the year 1986. It's famously known as the Plastic House of the Future for the use of plastic that encases the home, and basically everything else in the home being made of plastic. While by today's standards this thing is quite an eyesore, people seeing this for the first time in the 1950s were actually taken back by the futuristic style of the home. The reason the house has this iconic cross sign shape was so the owners of the home would have an easier time expanding the house if they wanted to. Imagine one day you walk inside your home and decide, man, our house is way too small. Wouldn't it just be nice to add another room without damaging the integrity of your other rooms in the home? This concept allowed for this to happen, as the idea was that if you wanted to expand the home, you would simply take the windows out and close off that section of the home. Eventually, you would be able to close off every section of the home until it held enough room for you to live in. Besides the outside of the house, going inside was what really wowed guests. The technologies that it featured were the kind of stuff that would have revolutionized everyday life back then. Cabinets and storage that appeared from nowhere, hidden cold zones for storing food behind the cabinets in place of a refrigerator, the bathroom having an adjustable sink with electric razors and toothbrushes being built right into the home, a built-in dishwasher that cleaned its dishes via ultrasonic waves, and to top it all off, there was even a depiction of video call phones in the walls. This is very similar to the popular Ring doorbells that a good amount of people own today. Obviously, a lot of these technologies were merely conceptual and not actually functional, as the technology wouldn't be seen for quite a few more years. That didn't stop Disney from putting these demonstrations in the guest's eye. All of these features combined with the unique design of the house brought in many people to Disneyland for the first time and became a fan favorite amongst parkgoers. It was so popular that the house began seeing more than 400,000 viewers within its first few months. One of the biggest factors in its popularity was the fact that this was one of the few free-to-ride attractions at the Disneyland Resort, as back then, Disney was still on the e-ticket system. Unfortunately, as with many attractions that try to depict the future, the ride would have to get constant cosmetic updates, forming the house to be more reflective of the current future and style. This reason, coupled with the fact that the ride had a decreasing amount of visitors, meant that it was overdue for a closure. In 1967, just 10 years after the initial opening, the House of the Future was finally closed. A fun fact about the home before we move on, when the demolition crew finally got around to destroying the House of the Future, it's said that the house was so sturdy that the crew's wrecking balls, torches, chainsaws, and jackhammers all failed and were unable to make so much as a dent in the house's structure. What happened with the wrecking balls was when they tried using them, they just simply bounced off the house. Eventually, the initially planned one-day demolition took almost a week, with the crew using choker chains to crush the building into smaller parts. On a lighter note, the Monsanto House of the Future's legacy lives on in many of Disneyland's creations, as it gave inspiration for other attractions such as the Carousel of Progress and the Innovention Center. Comment below if you are one of the lucky few that got to see this attraction in person. Moving on. America Sings. With the closure of the Carousel of Progress, the rotating theater in Tomorrowland would see a new attraction, an attraction called America Sings. America Sings was an attraction born out of America's upcoming bicentennial. This attraction was a stage show celebrating the history of American music. Despite not fitting the theme of Tomorrowland, the ride was greenlit because of how well it fit the original design of the theater. America Sings had a cast of animatronic characters singing all of these various songs. The design of these characters was based on the never-created Disney film, The Chanticleer. The film Chanticleer had a ton of concept art that Disney didn't want to go unused, so they used a fair amount of it in America Sings. The show was split into 6 sections, which obviously fit the design of the theater, with a prologue/loading area to start off with, then getting into 5 acts. Act 1 was the early South, Act 2 the Old West, Act 3 the gay 90s, Act 4 the modern times, and the last act being a finale and exiting area. The show was hosted by 2 entities, a patriotic looking eagle named Sam and this owl named Ollie. When the show started, Sam would begin singing Yankee Doodle before introducing the show to the audience. Then, as the show would rotate through each act, Sam would end each act performing different renditions of Yankee Doodle. Sam and Ollie appear in each act, wearing different clothes to represent each era that they are in. The attraction featured over 39 songs with tons of lifelike animatronics. It was actually quite impressive that all of this was combined into one long show. Now, the show didn't come without its few controversies. There are two big controversies that are always talked about. One that covers racism towards people of Mexican heritage, and the last one being a death that happened during one of the showings of the attraction. If you don't feel comfortable hearing about either of these incidents, look below in the comments for timestamps. You can skip to whichever one you'd like, or even skip both. Okay, now that I've warned you, let's get into the first one. Among the list of songs for the show, there was one song titled "Who Shot a Hole in My Sombrero?" This song was originally sang and performed in a Mexican accent. In fact, the show debuted with this original accent in place, but the press thought the accent was so offensive that Disney would be forced to replace the Mexican accent with a Texas accent. Here is a before and after so you guys can compare.
Shot the hole in my sombrero. Who would do a terrible thing like that? Was he Pancho from the rancho? Did he do this because I kissed his wife?
I can't say, girl, who pulled that trigger? You don't reckon my old wife could be back in town?
Now, besides the cultural issue, America Sings is home to one of the most horrific and grotesque accidents that any theme park has ever encountered. Less than 2 weeks after the initial opening of America Sings, 18-year-old cast member Deborah Gale Stone was working a late shift on the ride. Her job was to simply be a hostess that would greet guests as they made their way to their seats. Now, just so you guys understand how severe this incident was, Deborah Stone was an aspiring young adult like you and me. At the time, she had been saving up enough money to attend Iowa State University and even had plans to marry her current boyfriend. Unfortunately for her, on July 8th, 1974, she would talk to her parents on the phone for the last time. Just before the last show began for the night, Deborah called her parents, telling them how much she loved her boyfriend, asking for their permission to marry him in the near future. Shortly after this phone call ended, the last show began. During the show, guests became alert after hearing the screams of a young woman. Being that the show was very dark when transitioning between acts, no one knew where the sound came from. Guests reported the scream to cast members, which confused people as majority of the people believed that the scream was a part of the show. The truth eventually came out when people realized that the scream came from Deborah Stone. She had been crushed to death between the stationary wall of the seating area and the rotating wall of the stage. There has been much speculation as to how she ended up between these walls in the first place. Some explain how she must have stepped back too far from the stationary floor just at the wrong time, while others think she fell just before the wall came closing in. Disney learned from their mistake and installed breakaway walls as well as indicator lights. The parents of Deborah sued Disney for a small settlement and the situation quickly died down. Sadly, America Sings is more known for this death and not the joy that it brought many parkgoers. I can't imagine how hard this must have been on the family, and I don't even want to think about that situation happening to anyone that I know. The attraction would close in 1988, but thankfully, the animatronic characters were savored and put to use in what makes up today's Splash Mountain, Videopolis. Back in the 1980s, Disneyland was going through a big rough patch. Park attendance was declining as well as just general interest in going to Disneyland. The main reason for this was the lack of exciting thrill attractions for teenagers. You have to remember, at this time, the only rides that were there were rides that small children would enjoy. Children would beg their parents to bring them, and therefore, Disneyland's main demographic during this time was children and adults. The problem was that the group in the middle, specifically people from ages 12 to 21, had no real reason to go to the park. Disneyland's CEO at the time, Michael Eisner, quickly realized this when he brought his teenage son to the park and saw that there were no real attractions for him to go on. The solution for this came in the form of another attraction. In real 80s fashion, a teenage nightclub for people ages 14 to 21 was made up that went by the name of Videopolis. This nightclub was meant to appeal to those teenage kids that had no real reason to go to Disneyland. Now if you're sitting there scratching your head going, wait, so there was actually a nightclub inside Disneyland? Does that mean if I wanted to go to it, I'd have to purchase a ticket for the day if I wanted to go into the nightclub? That's exactly what you'd have to do. That might sound like a lot of money, but back then, Disneyland tickets were only $15, and the nightclub allowed entry without anything else besides having just your normal Disneyland ticket. Another question you might have is, who the hell came up with this idea and why? Videopolis was actually stolen from another famous amusement park at the time, Knott's Berry Farm. Knott's seems to have been the first park that introduced a nightclub in the form of Studio K, which was the same thing as Videopolis, but a bit lower budget. The main difference was that Studio K only costed $8 and it was built first. Videopolis actually did wonders for Disneyland, as there was a huge surge in park attendance after it went public. In its heyday, Videopolis had 70 screens with 2 humongous screens front and center. Videos would play on the screens showing popular music videos of the time period while people were out on the dance floor. The building also had a huge seating area with over 1,500 seats. This was so that during the day, the Videopolis building could run stage plays or events, and then at nighttime, the building would transform into the high-tech dance club. Videopolis was built in 1985 in the corner of Fantasyland. It was put in the corner because of how loud the music would get during the nighttime. For nearly a decade, the club would stay as teenagers enjoyed dancing the night away. It was so popular at one point that Disney began selling annual passes for Videopolis. For $90, you could have a season pass that allowed you access into Disneyland just to go to Videopolis. The only catch was that you could only go into the park after 5 p.m. Unfortunately, in 1995, the Videopolis Theater was changed into what we now see today as the Fantasyland Theater. There were many reasons for this change. The first came in the form of lawsuits. There was a lot of hate towards gay people during this time. In fact, if you were seen dancing with a partner of the same sex, the guards at Videopolis were trained to throw you out. One specific event that happened occurred when 2 gay men were thrown out of the club. This resulted in the 2 men winning a court case against Disneyland on the bounds of discrimination, citing that they should be able to dance together without any repercussions. And that's when Disneyland pulled one of the pettiest moves I've ever seen from a company this huge. I just really wanted to mention this because it made me laugh so freaking hard when I found out what Disney did. So, when Disney realized that they were going to lose this case, they found out a loophole out of the entire situation. The way that the case was framed and worded gave Disney a way out. The judge asked for Disney to allow the 2 gay men to dance. So Disney allowed it, but only for those 2 men. Disney outright said, yeah, you guys are right. We will allow these 2 specific men to dance, but any other same-sex couple or people will be thrown out if they are seen dancing together. This is the pettiest shit I've ever heard, and honestly made me crack up so hard because I can't even believe Disney was allowed to pull crap like this back in the day. Besides this case though, Disney eventually allowed same-sex dancing, but there was an even bigger issue that came up: gang violence. During the 80s in Los Angeles, it wasn't uncommon to find people from ages 14 to 21 in gangs. There were 2 separate incidents in which gang violence occurred on the park premises, with one event resulting in a kid getting shot to death and another in which 2 people were stabbed. This led to the decline in attendance of Videopolis, and eventually the entire place would close. Leave a comment below on your personal opinion of this attraction and if you'd go there if given the chance today. Moving on. Adventure Through Inner Space. The Adventure Through Inner Space was the attraction that originally occupied where current day Star Tours is located. This attraction first came to be when Monsanto approached Disneyland with a sponsorship. Monsanto, as you should know from earlier on the Iceberg, was the company that brought the Monsanto House of the Future to Disneyland. The Imagineers wanted to create an experience like no other. They wanted people to feel like they were shrinking down to the size of a molecule, experiencing life on a microscopic level. The main theme of this ride was water, as the entire ride was supposed to be you shrinking down to the size of a small snowflake, getting to see the inner workings and dimensions of such an object. This ride brought a lot of new ideas to the table, with the major one being the ride vehicles that the attraction was set to use. The Imagineers had an idea of what they wanted people to experience when on the ride, but the issue that they were running into was that they wanted to be able to control the guest's perspective when on the attraction. The solution to this was to simply make the ride vehicles concave in so that it blocked off guests' peripheral vision. Then the idea was to simply make the vehicles able to rotate 360 degrees in order to fully control what guests would experience on this ride. If you've ever gone on the Haunted Mansion, the ride vehicles in that ride are the same design as the ones on the Adventure Through Inner Space. Now that Imagineers had come up with the ride idea and how they were going to achieve it, the only thing left to do was to create the ride. Finally, in 1967, the ride was released to the public. The cool thing about this attraction was that it was also a free-to-ride attraction like the Monsanto House of the Future, being exempt from the e-ticket system. The ride itself was revolutionary, as many recall it having one of the first very creative and stunning ride queues, with guests being able to see other parkgoers shrinking down to the size of a snowflake. Apparently, this illusion was done so well that children getting on the ride truly believed that they were shrinking down. All the while, you had narration from Paul Frees telling you of what's going to happen. This was done by having speakers within all of the ride vehicles. Once you got to the microscope, the narrator would tell you of his past journeys, being shrunken down himself, taking you through a labyrinth of snowflakes. Guests would then be treated with a giant snowflake, ensuring them that they had in fact shrank down. You would begin to shrink even further, reaching a room full of molecules. Mirrors were used here in order to make the room appear as if it was packed with more molecules than it actually had. The journey continued further, with guests shrinking down to the mere size of an atom. The narration began again, asking himself if he wanted to go even further. The narrator would then tell himself that he should get back to normal size, at which point guests were met with the end of the ride growing back to normal size. The ride would end with a walkthrough of products from Monsanto. Eventually, this part of the ride would transform into a gift shop, creating one of the first rides that ended with a gift shop for guests to walk into. The ride went through some changes during its run. When the ride opened, teenagers began trying to steal the molecules that were actually just wire balls hanging from the ceiling. This prompted Disney to install cameras in the ride and speed the ride up. However, this ended up screwing over the timing that the audio in the vehicles had, which made the ride seem off. The ride was super unique and had quite a long run, lasting almost 18 years until it was eventually replaced by Star Tours. Rocket to the Moon. Rocket to the Moon opened in 1955 along with the opening of Disneyland. There's not much history to this ride. Walt Disney simply wanted to create a ride that made guests feel as though they were being shot to the moon and back. This was the first attraction to ever take normal, everyday people through such a simulation, as real space travel wouldn't be achieved until 1961 when Yuri Gagarin was successfully launched into space. By the way, I have another Iceberg series that goes over some interesting theories on that space endeavor. Anyways, Rocket to the Moon was a simple ride. It was located near the back of Tomorrowland and took place inside the building that we know today as the Alien Pizza Planet, or you guys might know it as the Red Pizza Port. The ride featured round theater seating with all of the guests sitting around a circular screen on the floor and a circular screen on the ceiling. A film would begin playing as the ground shook. Guests would then shoot up into the sky, with the floor screen showing guests leaving the Disney theme park and the top screen showing their destination, the moon. Guests would simply make a journey around the moon once and then safely land back down to Earth. During the flight, a narrator would begin talking, teaching guests facts about the moon. The ride would go through two major changes during its lifetime, with it being renamed as Flight to the Moon when New Tomorrowland opened in 1967 under the McDonnell Douglas sponsorship. Then it was changed yet again in 1975 to Mission to Mars. The main difference between these two rides was now you would be taking a journey to Mars instead of the moon, but the entire process was basically the same. Unfortunately, due to declining interest in space travel, the ride closed on November 2nd, 1992. and wouldn't see the light of day until nearly 6 years later as Red Rocket's Pizza Port. A scaled down replica of the original rocket used on display for Rocket to the Moon was put in front of the restaurant and can be seen to this day. Mike Fink's Keelboats. Mike Fink's Keelboats is an attraction based on Disney's version of Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett is a character from Walt Disney's Disneyland series, which was a series that debuted on TV, showcasing stories relating to various lands around Disneyland. Frontierland's rendition utilized Davy Crockett to tell its story. In one episode, there was a keelboat race against Mike Fink, King of the River. During the production of this episode, Walt Disney thought it would be an awesome idea to utilize the real boats used for the episode as a ride to be featured in Frontierland. And so, the ride known as Mike Fink's Keelboats was born. The original boats from the TV show were used, but were remodeled in order to put windows so that people could fit inside the boats. Guests were given a choice between riding Davy Crockett's Bertha May or Mike Fink's Gollywhumper. The ride simply took you around the rivers of America, with some narration playing in the background. This one did close one time during 1995, but reopened later in 1996. However, when it returned, a major accident occurred, which, unlike a lot of the other entries on this list, actually got the ride closed. During one ride of the keelboats, the Gollywhumper boat is said to have been overloaded with guests on the top level, and due to being overloaded, the boat began rocking from side to side until eventually it capsized, dumping a full boat of guests into the rivers of America. The boats, along with the Bertha May, were removed from the river for inspections. The people that rode the boats that day would be the last people to ever ride Mike Fink's keelboats. The Bertha May was put up for auction on eBay and sold for over $15,000. As for the Gollywhumper, well, they returned to the rivers of America as a prop. After sitting there for some years, accruing nasty algae and dust, the boat was restored to its original 1955 appearance and placed back in the river. This was all done when in 2010, Disneyland drained the rivers of America for a park revamp. Even after the 2017 rerouting of the rivers of America to make way for Star Wars Land, the Gollywhumper still remains in the rivers to this day. Original Pirates of the Caribbean. So a lot of people might be shocked to learn that the Pirates of the Caribbean ride wasn't based on the movie. The movie was actually based on the ride. This becomes more apparent when you realize that the ride came out in 1967 and the movie was released nearly 26 years later in 2003. The original idea for Pirates of the Caribbean was created sometime after the New York World's Fair. Because of the World's Fair, Walt Disney and the Imagineers decided that they wanted to utilize audio animatronics on a pirate-themed ride. The attraction had to be built underneath New Orleans Square in order for there to be enough room for the entire attraction. The original ride featured lots of crude and shocking elements by today's standards. And of course, because the ride came out first, Jack Sparrow and all the other movie references were not on the original ride. So it was a totally different experience than what you might see today. The ride that we know today tells the story of Captain Barbossa and his gang of pirates that ravaged a town looking for Jack Sparrow. But the original version told a much simpler story. The original attraction showed a gang of pirates that ransacked a town and had their way with pretty much everyone there. This version included animatronics that implied very crude acts, such as this part right here, where a pirate can be seen holding a shoe and an undergarment belonging to presumably the lady in the barrel next to him, implying that he forced himself onto this poor woman. Also, the woman animatronics that run in circles chasing the men was originally the other way around, with dirty men chasing the women, with the only overweight woman being the one that is chasing the man. While at first people thought that these scenes were comical, people eventually began ridiculing and criticizing the ride for its depiction of women and the crude acts. The ride went through some changes until eventually the movie came out and the ride was changed into what we see today. Funny enough, one of these scenes that remains is the Wench Bride auction scene. Disney says that they believe some stuff should be kept in for historical accuracy, and as such, we are left with this scene in the ride to this day. The only Pirates of the Caribbean version that remains untouched from the original design is the one in Disneyland Paris. that Pirates of the Caribbean still has all of the offensive events within the attraction. Flying Saucers. The Flying Saucers was the original Luigi's Flying Tires. This ride was conceived out of the 1961 Tomorrowland obsession with space travel. The poster itself tells you enough. I like this version of the ride much better than Luigi's Flying Tires, so it's basically the same idea as before. You ride on a hockey puck and the floor is the hockey table. The difference here is that each ride vehicle only sat one person, which is how it should have been done with Luigi's Flying Tires. Just like Luigi's Flying Tires, this ride was prone to one big problem: steering the freaking saucers. It was a bit better with this incarnation. As you can see from the videos, you actually bump people in this ride instead of just slowly making your way towards them and giving them a little love tap. However, the problem you can see almost immediately is that if you didn't weigh enough or were unable to control your weight, you'd flop around like a fucking idiot like this. This ride even did a better job managing the queue times, as there were 64 flying saucers in total, with 32 flying saucers being in use at any given time. The ride, as stated before, sat in Tomorrowland, and it was actually smack dab in the middle. If you've ever eaten at that burger place in Tomorrowland that holds those Star Wars shows occasionally, that stage that the shows are held on is where the Flying Saucers ride used to be. The Flying Saucers would be short-lived, as the remodel for New Tomorrowland came in 1967, which cut the ride in favor of the Tomorrowland stage. I honestly would have loved to go on this ride instead of what we got nearly a few decades later. Leave a comment below on which ride you'd rather go on: Luigi's Flying Tires or the Flying Saucers. Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland. Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland first debuted as a different name in 1956. In 1956, the ride premiered in Frontierland as Rainbow Caverns Mine Train. The original ride took guests on a tour through the fictional Rainbow Caverns. Honestly, this ride was beautiful, especially once you entered inside the caverns. The problem that this ride suffered is that it wasn't originally captivating enough for guests. Walt Disney himself even admitted this and said that he wanted more from the attraction. And in Walt Disney fashion, he spent almost $2 million renovating the ride, and 4 years later in 1960, the ride debuted as the Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland. The $2 million went towards creating a fictional wonderland. The difference between the original ride and this new one was the introduction of 200 plus animal animatronics and more beautifully done set pieces. The ride began in the mining town of Rainbow Ridge, taking you through a train tunnel into what they called Beaver Valley. All the while a narrator would talk of the sights. Fun fact, the narrator for this ride is the same narrator for Big Thunder Mountain. Anyways, after Beaver Valley, you'd make your way under the waterfalls of Cascade Peak, passing into Bear Country, then the Living Desert, and then ending with the colorful depths of the Rainbow Caverns. As you can see from the footage, Walt Disney went all out, putting in as many lifelike animatronics as he could in the ride to give it that extra oomph that it needed to captivate guests into going on it again and again. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough, as the ride would close in 1977 in favor of a more iconic and thrilling attraction, Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, which opened in 1979. Now, the original Nature's Wonderland ride still lives on in Big Thunder Mountain. For example, the town of Rainbow Ridge can be seen at the end of Big Thunder Mountain. It's also a part of this attraction's loading area. Some of the skeletons, such as the dinosaur skeleton, are used in Big Thunder Mountain as well. The caverns at the beginning of Big Thunder Mountain are a nod to the old Rainbow Caverns, although they are not quite as colorful. Triton's Garden. Triton's Garden refers to the old meet and greet area in Fantasyland that premiered in 1996. If you remember the Monsanto House of the Future, that attraction was replaced by another attraction simply called the Alpine Gardens, which was then turned into King Triton's Garden from the Little Mermaid series. The cool thing about the change from the Monsanto House to Triton's Garden is that Triton's Garden officially marked this plot of land to belong to Fantasyland instead of the original Tomorrowland. Even though the garden is based on the Tomorrowland side of the Matterhorn, it still counts as being part of Fantasyland. Walking up to the garden, you could see King Triton in the lake with water coming out of his trident. Streams of water would shoot out of the ground, and you could even see Ariel resting on a waterfall fountain. Walking further into the garden revealed Ariel's grotto, which was the official meet and greet spot for that character. When it was time for Ariel to meet the guests, her shell would turn around, revealing her waiting for people to take pictures. This spot lasted nearly 12 years as it came to an end in August of 2008. This part of the area was transformed into what we now know today as Pixie Hollow. Most of you may remember another place by the name of Ariel's Grotto in California Adventure. That's because there was a restaurant that used to be named Ariel's Grotto, and funny enough, Disney didn't want to waste their statue of King Triton, so they removed it from the water and just sat it on top of the restaurant. Unfortunately, you can't view it today anymore, as even the restaurant has been changed into another by the name of Lamplight Lounge. I believe when I was younger, I went to Ariel's Grotto once, but I remember it very vividly. I did, however, get a chance to eat at the restaurant Ariel's Grotto in California Adventure before it closed. This will bring us to Layer 5. Layer 5 is filled with attractions that aren't acknowledged pretty much at all, but are still known by a small group of deep Disney fans. And in some way, shape, or form, most of these attractions have remnants present that are a lot harder to spot. I will call this layer the lesser known remnants. The World According to Goofy. The World According to Goofy was a parade at Disneyland that ran for a year and a half in 1992. The neat thing about this parade was it tried to show the history of the world if everything was goofified. Don't really know if that's a word, but it is now. With everything goofified, you would get monstrosities like this goofy golf ball, or these 90s dad jokes like this painting of Marco Pollo. The parade would start off with Ludwig von Drake leading the first float that is made up of these big history books, with these dancers opening their textbooks to reveal the name Goofy. Each float after this takes the audience into different time periods in the world. First, of course, is the pre-hysterical age. This part featured dinosaurs accompanied by these cocktail waitress looking dancers, very Flintstones-esque. Oddly enough, the lore in this part is nothing short of hilarious. Through the floats, you are basically told that at some point or another, Goofy or some other person opened up these tar pits as spas, which eventually led to the extinction of the dinosaurs, which leads us to the next age, the Egyptian days. Keep in mind, you'd be able to tell the name of the era that you're watching because a huge book titled whatever the era would be would lead the next part of the parade in. So for example, in this area, you would see this big textbook that says the Egyptian days. Leading the Egyptian part of the parade was this very weird, goofy-faced golf ball with a snake on its head. The reason for the golf ball Goofy is because of Goofy's vision of ancient Egypt. Goofy's vision of ancient Egypt takes the form of a golfing tournament. Why a golfing tournament? I have no idea, but he's Goofy, he can do whatever he wants. Only other thing worth mentioning is that the song that plays during this part is oddly similar to Aladdin's Friend Like Me song, which wouldn't be released into theaters until November of 1992. On to the second to last time period. Here we are in the Renaissance, which is Goofy's take on the Renaissance. This is focused around the rise of food, with Goofy's construction of the Leaning Tower of Pizza. We also get this masterpiece of a painting of Marco Pollo and his discovery of fried chicken. The final part of the parade is Goofy running for president. That's literally all that happens during this part. It's just Goofy with his friends, Donald, Pluto, Chip, and Dale, all riding in Goofy's Pace Bus. The parade then ends with this huge inflatable Uncle Sam Goofy float that has Goofy running a marathon trying to get to the finish line. Side note before we move on, this parade was changed following the 1992 elections to instead feature Goofy becoming Man of the Year instead of him running for president. What a fun and weird parade, and definitely something that I wish I could have gotten to experience. If it wasn't stated already, this one was actually found in the Disneyland park as opposed to the California Adventure Park. Golden Dreams. Golden Dreams refers to a film that played in Disneyland's California Adventure from its opening date in 2001 all the way to its closing date in 2008. If you know where the Little Mermaid ride is now, that's the building that this film was shown in. The main difference between the building then and now was the inside of the building at that time held a massive theater instead of the under the sea ride that is there now. Walking inside the theater, you'd see these weird statues modeled after Whoopi Goldberg hanging off the side of the walls. Once the show started, a light would bring these statues to life and they'd start giving you information about the film that you were about to watch. Now, the main purpose of this film was to tell the story of California's history, starting with the gold rush and troubles that Chinese laborers endured while working on the railroad, then moving to immigration issues, the Great Depression, and then even showing more modern events that took place, such as the invention of the Apple II that Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs created and marketed. Throughout the film, Whoopi Goldberg is seen giving many of the characters motivation at their lowest points, such as this part where these men throw junk at this foreign woman just because of her ethnicity. Then Goldberg gives her a reassuring look and tells her to be strong. Most of the film showcases these rather hard to stomach moments in California's history, and I really appreciate that they didn't hold back with some of the depictions. One of the more devastating parts of this film is the scene which depicts what working on the railroads was like for the Chinese laborers. While every other group is able to effortlessly light their fuses on fire and get lifted up, one group takes way too long to light their match and they seemingly just blow up along with the mountainside. Kinda wild for Disney to show this, especially since it's at Disneyland and not on TV, but I do appreciate the fact that they didn't shy away from telling it how it was. Obviously, it's all a dramatization of real events that took place, but it still gets the point across that some of these moments in history weren't all rainbows and sunshine. The film lasted around 22 minutes long, including the introduction while sitting in the theater. If you want to see the entire thing yourself, I will leave a link below to a YouTube video of someone that was able to record the entire film before it closed. Electronica. I've been dying to talk about this entry because it's one of the few on the list that I personally got to experience. Electronica is a nighttime dance party event that took place in Hollywoodland in Disney's California Adventure. To build hype for the upcoming release of the Tron Legacy movie, Electronica debuted 2 months before Tron Legacy on October 8th of 2010. This was a huge dance/nightclub that would take over the streets of Hollywoodland once 8 p.m. would hit. Once 8 o'clock hit, the portal would open and you'd feel like you walked straight into the world of Tron Legacy. There were dancers with glowing hula hoops, martial artists doing flips in the air with replica identity discs, and just all sorts of futuristic tech and scenery. The best part of it, at least in my opinion, was what awaited at the end of the entire lot. Flynn's Arcade. Taken directly from the movie, there was an old flickering Flynn's Arcade sign, and man, this arcade was taken straight from the 80s. You had all the classics, Donkey Kong, Pac-Man, Centipede, and many others that people love and adore. And of course, they had the original Tron machine. Nonetheless, this arcade, along with the awesome spectacles that awaited outside, would leave a lasting impression on anyone. I don't know if it's just my 11-year-old brain or nostalgia talking, but I really genuinely love this event. I remember always begging my mom to stay longer just so I could experience Electronica and spend some time in the arcade. Also, just one last thing I want to mention before we move on. The sickest part of the arcade was that they gave you these really cool Flynn's Arcade tokens that really looked like they were from the movie. Putting $1 in the token machine, you would leave with 4 great souvenirs. I kept mine for almost 11 years now, and just pulling it out and looking at it, it really just takes me back to the day that I got it. Like many things in this world, the days of Electronica and the Flynn's Arcade were numbered, as both closed permanently on April 15th of 2012. Disney's Aladdin, a musical spectacular. The Disney veterans should all know about this experience. Disney's Aladdin, a musical spectacular, was one of the longest running shows at Disneyland, with its original opening debut on January of 2003 and staying for nearly 13 years to January of 2016. This show had a special charm to it that I don't think I can really express through words, but those who have experienced it know exactly what I'm talking about. From the hilarious modern jokes that the genie would make to the heart-dropping apple throw scene, there were many moments of the show that, although many of us knew were coming, still kept me entertained. I'm pretty sure I watched this show every single time that I went to the Disney parks, right up until the day that it closed. The show was a live-action depiction of Disney's Aladdin that was honestly just a shot-for-shot remake of the original Disney movie, with the major change of cutting Abu from the cast. I imagine Abu was cut because it may have been way too difficult to train a monkey or use a puppet to play that character. Oddly enough, Iago was still in the show, always being manned by a puppet master that would speak for him as well. Now, I'm not going to summarize the entire show because it's literally just the Aladdin film reimagined into a Broadway musical, so instead I will talk about the notable parts that I always found entertaining, starting with how you actually got inside to watch the show. Almost like a movie theater, the show times will be posted outside of the Hyperion Theater, and as you made your way through the initial entrance, you would make a choice if you wanted to be seated on the floor level, the second level, or the top level. What was neat about this show was that no matter where you sat in the theater, there was always something for you to interact with. If you got the floor seat, you would be up close and personal with the actors during the Prince Ali song. And later in the show, when A Whole New World was playing, if you were on the second or top floor, you would be able to get up close and personal with the actors that would literally fly through the sky on a magic carpet. Little touches like this is what made this show as charming as it could be, but nothing in the show was nowhere near as charming as the actors that played the genie. The actors and actresses would change depending on the time of day, but I swear man, every single genie I watched always freaking killed it. Props to Disney for hiring some quick and witty actors because the genie would almost always steal the show, cracking jokes and frequently breaking the fourth wall throughout the musical. The genie just made the audience feel way more involved than any other theater show I've personally been to. Also, a major plus to this attraction was the ability to just sit down for 45 minutes in an air-conditioned room. This attraction saved me many times throughout my many Disney park adventures when all I wanted to do was rest my feet, relax, and depending on the time of day, even allowed me to take a quick nap that would help me power through the rest of my day at Disneyland. Truly a fun show that was almost replaced a bit earlier than expected. There was supposed to be a Toy Story musical that was going to replace the show in 2010, but for some unknown reason, it was cancelled and later shown on some Disney's cruise ships instead. And so, the Aladdin musical would live on until 2016 when it was officially announced that the Aladdin show would be replaced for a live-action depiction of Frozen. This was a personal favorite of mine that I wish would make a return because there's just something about the new Frozen show that isn't nearly as charming as this show was. The Mad Tea Party. The Mad Tea Party was basically the same exact thing as the Electronica Nighttime Spectacular, except it was modeled after Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland. Some notable changes from Electronica to the Mad Tea Party is the time. Electronica would start at 8 p.m. while the Mad Tea Party started 2 hours earlier at 6 p.m. This was mainly because the Tron theme heavily relied on it being nighttime to hit as hard, while the Mad Tea Party's visuals could be enjoyed with a little bit of sunlight. As expected, the visuals of this nighttime event were still quite enjoyable. I mean, it is Alice in Wonderland after all. Very colorful, almost psychedelic-like animations, really pretty lights, and other obscure set pieces were what made the Mad Tea Party such a cool event to experience. Also, while Electronica was more like a nightclub DJ experience, the Mad Tea Party was more like a big concert. The Mad Tea Party band would play on stage, performing covers of music by contemporary artists like Bruno Mars, Maroon 5, The Beatles, and many others. These would be performed under the House of Cards stage that was way more stunning to watch after nighttime hit. Alongside the concert was the cocktail club nearby, and just like Electronica, there was the Mad Arcade, housing the same exact games as the Flint's Arcade, but with a beautifully done Alice in Wonderland theme. The original run of the Mad Tea Party was from June 15th, 2012 to November 30th, 2014. I will admit, I didn't enjoy this iteration nearly as much as the Electronica event, but it's still one of those one-of-a-time experiences that many Disney fans begged to come back. And I must have been in the minority here because the Mad Tea Party was actually brought back for Disneyland's 60th anniversary in May 22nd of 2015. And it ran for a whole year until it was finally scrapped for good, on March 30th of 2016. A spiritual successor to the Mad Tea Party was the Avengers Training Initiative, which was just a mere stage show that didn't last too long. I really wish Disney would bring something like this back to Hollywoodland during the night times, because at night, Hollywoodland seems a bit lifeless as of late. There are some really cool things going on during the day with Avengers Land and such, but around nighttime, that entire side of the park just seems a bit dead. At least that's my experience going to the parks. Halyx. Halyx was a rock band that would play in Disneyland's Tomorrowland. Their initial opening date was on June 20th of 1981 and should be seen as an experimental attempt on Disney's part to create a new type of entertainment at the Disneyland resort. To form a group like this and have it perform in the 1980s was quite ambitious, as every other type of entertainment at the park was quite tame. The main reason this was even created was because of the recent success of the Star Wars franchise, so Disney executives got to work on how to capitalize off of that success. Now, unlike some of the other types of concerts that were done, this band was really a band. After many auditions for the crew, they settled on Laura Mumford for lead vocals, Roger Freeland for bass, keyboardist Tom Miller, percussionist Tony Capalla, guitarist Bruce Gowdy, drummer Brian Lucas, and backup vocals Jeanette Klinger and Karen Tobin. Sorry if I butchered any of those names, but the band only performed for one season in 1981 from June 20th to September 11th. What set this group apart from all the other bands that also performed at Disneyland was that Halyx got to perform on the Space Mountain stage, which no other band had gotten to do at that time. Unfortunately, the only footage I've been able to find comes from the documentary that Defunctland posted on their channel. However, their music from their performances can be found easily on YouTube, so I will leave a link to both. As for the performance itself, it was a mix of human and non-human costumed people. Some of the notable parts of the performance were when Tom Miller would come onto stage, as he would roll up on this futuristic vehicle while absolutely killing his part. Another eye-catcher of the performance was the drum riser, which would literally rise up the drums above the stage while somebody was playing them. The drummer of the band has stated multiple times that it was very nerve-wracking during this part because the platform would actually jiggle with every single movement that he made, making the job way harder to do, especially on stage in front of thousands of people. Those were the main things that stood out to me, but there are so many other parts to this performance that made it quite the spectacle to be seen. Honestly, one of the strangest and greatest attractions that Disney has ever thrown together. I highly recommend watching the documentary below for the entire picture, as it goes super in depth on not only how the band was made, but how exactly the performances were done. Motorboat Cruise. The Motorboat Cruise opened in 1957 on the border of Fantasyland and Tomorrowland. This ride should be seen as Autopia, but if you were driving boats instead of cars. They used an underwater railing system similar to that of Pirates of the Caribbean. They left the rails spaced very far apart, so it gave the illusion that the guest was actually steering the boat. This is very similar to how the Autopia track is done, with that skinny beam allowing you to steer the car without feeling like you have training wheels on. The only problem with this ride though was that guests did not know that there was a predetermined route. Some guests genuinely thought that they were steering the boat, so a common issue that would occur on this ride is two boats getting stuck against each other on the track. Imagine this is the railing and there are these two boats. Let's say the driver in boat A is just a terrible driver. They would most likely be pressing up against the railing, and the railing would slowly but surely guide them to the end of the course. Now the driver in boat B sees how slow boat A is going, so they decide, okay, I'm just gonna drive around them. The reason the driver in boat B thinks he can make this turn and actually drive around boat A is because from his point of view, there technically is enough clearance if the boats were actually being steered by them. You see, here is the clearance that the drivers were seeing, but underneath the water where the actual railings were, here's the actual clearance for both boats. So when driver B tries to overtake driver A, he rubs up against the railing, causing his boat to mush in between the railings with the other boat. This would happen so much that cast members had to be trained on how to get the boats unstuck. Now, what really sucked for cast members during this time was that if the boats got stuck somewhere that wasn't close to land, they were expected to actually dive in the water just to get the boats unstuck. I am exaggerating a bit because the river wasn't that deep. The deepest it would get was up to some employees' upper chest, but you could easily walk around in the water. But still, they'd have to get their clothes wet and whatever else they had on would just get drenched, just to get the boats unstuck so the ride could operate. As for the ride itself, it wasn't anything too special. You just cruise around the river that lied between Tomorrowland and Fantasyland. There was some scenery put in place, but nothing too fancy from the footage I was able to find. Due to the ever-growing demand for more action-packed rides like Star Tours and Space Mountain, the ride would officially close in 1993 and was never replaced by anything. In fact, the queue for the ride can still be accessed today. If you walk past the Matterhorn, there is this small area that used to be the entrance for this ride. Nowadays, the loading area is filled with patio seating and is a quiet gem that not many park guests even know about. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Play it. This is a rather interesting entry as it's a one-of-a-kind show that many don't know about. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Play It was a replica of the popular game show and could be visited in Disneyland's California Adventure in the Hollywood Pictures backlot. Going inside to experience this attraction was like stepping into the actual studio of the original game show. Each run of this attraction would last around 25 minutes long and would house around 600 park guests inside. The Disney version of this game did differ from the television version in one huge way. You didn't win any money. Instead, contestants competed for points, and each level that they passed, they would win a Disney's collector pin. What was cool about this attraction was that anyone in the audience could be chosen to be in the hot seat and have a chance at winning those Disney collector pins. When the show would start, a host or hostess would come out and explain the rules of the game. Every single audience member had their own keypad with the letters A, B, C, and D on them. To kick off the session, a fastest finger question would start off the entire event. Whoever answered this question correctly and the fastest would get the hot seat. Now you might be wondering, what was the point of these 10 seats around the center if anybody in the audience could be chosen? And honestly, these were mostly just for show. The people chosen to be in these specific seats were mostly chosen at random, or if you had a magic moment coupon that would allow you basically RSVP entry into any of these seats. However, they did not give you any type of advantage, and you'd still have to be the fastest guest in order to get into the hot seat. The hot seat contestant would then be brought down and the real game would start. The game itself was just like the show, with there being tiers to each question, increasing in point value and total time given to answer each one. If at any point the hot seat contestant wanted to walk away, the person in the room with the highest total point value would be given the hot seat, and this would carry on until the time for the session ran out. Usually 1 or 2 games could be played in any given session. Other than this though, it was pretty much Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. You had lifelines and such, so it wasn't all too different. Definitely something that many don't really remember from my experience at least. If you have any story or experience with this show or any of the attraction I've talked about this far, I'd really love to hear about it, so feel free to share your stories below. Astro Jets. Not going to spend too much time on this one as I've already talked about its successor, and it's basically the same exact ride. If you remember the Rocket Jets entry from the last few videos, this is the original ride that came out. The main difference between the Rocket Jets and this ride was the Astro Jets had a different color scheme and overall theme, modeling a combination of white, red, and blue colors. This attraction also sat smack dab in the middle of Tomorrowland and served as an icon for walking into this section of the land. It was very hard to miss as it was probably the biggest machinery in sight. Also, a huge difference between the Astro Jets and the Rocket Jets was the fact that you did not have to take an elevator just to get on the ride. This ride would last nearly 10 years until it was changed to Rocket Jets, and well, you know what happened from there. Honey, I Shrunk the Audience. Honey, I Shrunk the Audience is the show that replaced Captain EO at Tomorrowland's Magic Eye Theater. The show debuted in May of 1998 with a runtime of 18 minutes. This show was based off of the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids movies. If you went when it was running, you'd be given the classic 3D glasses disguised as safety goggles and be told to find a seat inside. In the story of this attraction, you are attending the Inventor of the Year award ceremony in which Professor Wayne Szalinski would be receiving said award. As the ceremony begins, Wayne Szalinski introduces himself by flying on stage as a miniaturized version of himself as he rode his new transportation device called the Hoverpod. Things go south when he loses control of the remote and gets set flying off behind the stage. When it comes time to receive his award, he knocks down the big sign, and then the show really begins. As the crew searches for Wayne, Wayne's youngest son puts a mouse in his dad's duplication machine, which introduces the audience to one of the first 4D effects that the show had. In this case, as the mice began to duplicate, the audience could feel loose mice running around and under their seats, and then there was a 3D effect used later on that would scare the mice away. A cat would slowly morph into a huge scary lion and leap at the audience. After Wayne is found and gets resized, he demonstrates his new shrinking machine that he accidentally shoots at the audience. From this point on, the rest of the show is a bunch of special effects that really gave the show its charm. The show frequently used ways to make the audience feel as though they were very tiny. Some of these included shaking the theater and moving the audience's seats to match the film. There's even one part in which Adam picks up the entire audience and shows them around the room that they are in. We even get a glimpse of ourselves in the audience right at this part. The show slowly comes to an end right after Wayne fixes his machine and resizes the audience. I remember seeing this show a few times as a kid, but the only thing I really remembered was the mice part. At least the first time that I saw it, it really did feel like there were tiny mice running up and down my back. This show didn't last too long, and in 2010 was replaced by the original show that it was meant to replace, Captain EO. Only this time, Captain EO was brought back under the name Captain EO Tribute, which was the same exact show as before, but it was a bit higher quality from what I remember. Remember Dreams Come True. Remember Dreams Come True is the name given to the fireworks display at Disneyland that has been brought back more than a few times because of how spectacular the event is. Its original opening date was May 1st of 2005, and for its time was one of the best shows at the Disneyland park. The show was brought in to celebrate Disney's 50th anniversary and would start off telling people the beauty of dreams and how important they are to chase. Accompanied with a beautiful musical score, amazing pyrotechnics, and awesome projections, the fireworks would begin shooting out of the castle, lighting up the night sky. The entire show was a total of 15 minutes long of straight fireworks, and man, was it really something to see. There isn't much I can really say to describe it because it's just a fireworks show, unlike the other attractions on this list where I can tell you about the amazing decor, history, and all whatnot. There isn't too much that this show is besides the awesome projections that would light up the castle, as well as the grand finale that would end off the entire show. I will say that the projections worked similar to how the World of Color show is. Each time the music would change, so would the castle and the projection that lit it up. You'd be taken through music from Cinderella, Pinocchio, Aladdin, The Little Mermaid, Pirates of the Caribbean, and various other Disney shows, which would all be accompanied by projections onto the Disneyland castle. As stated before, this has been at Disneyland more than just the one season. It has been at the Disneyland park a total of 4 times. First was for the original 50th anniversary, then it came back for the 60th anniversary, then again for Pixar Fest, and then it was brought back randomly near the end of 2018, only for it to be permanently replaced in 2019 by Mickey's Mix Magic. I feel like fireworks shows only hit hard in person, but if you want to see the show yourself, I will leave a link below to a video of the 2018 iteration. Skull Rock and Pirates Cove. Right next to the iconic Storybook ride used to be another lesser known icon, which was the Skull Rock Cove. The Skull Rock in Pirates Cove refers to an area of the park that was themed around the film Peter Pan. I believe this area of the park opened alongside Disneyland on July 17th of 1955. There was a restaurant under the name the Chicken of the Sea Pirate Ship Restaurant, which was a restaurant that was based around the Jolly Roger ship from the Peter Pan film. The Skull Rock was a 1960 addition that served as a backdrop for the new seating area. There really isn't much else to be said about the scenery here. It really was just a skull rock and a pirate ship. Some rock work where the skull stood can still be seen beside Monstro the whale. This appears to be the only remnant from the Skull Rock Cove, but don't feel too bad if you didn't get to experience this one yourself. If you're ever in Disneyland Paris, there is another iteration of the Skull Rock that you can actually walk inside from what I have found. This will bring us to Layer 6. Layer 6 specifically goes in depth on a ton of very old attractions. Most of these were the ones that Disneyland debuted with, or they were added on during the early years of Disneyland. Keller's Jungle Killers. This attraction was spawned out of another attraction simply known as the Mickey Mouse Club Circus. During the opening year of 1955, there was a huge amount of unused space that Walt Disney felt would be perfectly filled with a huge circus. One of the main acts was Professor Keller's Fantastic Felines. This act would later become Keller's Jungle Killers in 1956 when the circus closed. This specific tiger act was actually preserved from the circus just because it was the biggest crowd favorite at the time, so Disney didn't want it to go to waste. When Keller's Jungle Killers debuted all that time ago, it actually debuted as a B ticket attraction. This is kind of crazy because if you were to see a show back then when it was running, you'd be in for sparkly outfits brought upon by Keller himself, as well as a variety of leopards, lions, and tigers, with his most famous stunt being Keller placing his head inside of a lion's mouth. Now, it wasn't too crazy of an act because all of the animals in the act were actually declawed beforehand, and at some points they were even sedated just to ensure Keller's safety. Unfortunately, this was short-lived, not even lasting an entire year before it was closed. A mere 7 months after it debuted, Keller's Jungle Killers was closed for good. And to make matters worse, there's no concrete answer as to why this attraction was closed, but based on what I found online, I believe that the Matterhorn's construction was a huge part as to why this attraction was taken out, as the Matterhorn sits dead center of where the circus was placed originally. Circle Vision 360. Nowadays, the idea of 360 video isn't that crazy, and in fact, there's a ton of videos on YouTube that you can look up right now that have this feature enabled. But back in 1955, the sheer concept of having a 360-degree film was basically unheard of. This is why it was so amazing when Walt Disney actually managed to pull this off in an attraction known as Circle Vision 360, aka the Circorama. The way this attraction was filmed was even more impressive. They mounted 11 cameras on top of an American Motors car, and they drove it from Beverly Hills all the way to Las Vegas and then to Monument Valley, capturing the entire trip and cutting it into a 12-minute film that guests could watch and enjoy. And keep in mind, this entire attraction was in a 360-degree dome theater, with screens placed all around to give the feel of a 360-degree movie. Going inside the theater wasn't too difficult, as you did not actually need a ticket to go in. It was entirely free to enter, and seeing as it was a huge space, had air conditioning, and didn't require any money to enter, it was a pretty popular attraction among parkgoers despite not having any seats. You were forced to stand up to watch the entire show without so much as a guardrail to lean on. Regardless, people loved the attraction and the film. Speaking of which, the film itself was not Circle Vision 360. Circle Vision 360 and Circorama were just the name of the building and the theater that housed this type of movie. The film would actually change in the upcoming years, as there were a few other films that were put in place of the original one. The original film that ran in the Circorama theater was called A Tour of the West, and it would eventually be replaced by a 16-minute film, America the Beautiful. The neat thing about this film was it was chock full of aerial shots, as well as showcasing a prototype of a picture phone, which is basically modern day FaceTime. This film would last until 1967, when the Tomorrowland makeover would change the Circorama Theater into the Circle Vision Theater. The next film that would replace America the Beautiful was actually a remake or rendition of that film. Only this time it was filmed on 9 different 8mm cameras, and it was projected on 9 way bigger screens. The entire attraction was completely overhauled. There was even a new introduction pre-show area where guests would wait in a room decorated with flags from all 50 US states. A few times every hour, the host would play and identify the flag game with guests, which was a pretty cool way to entertain parkgoers while they waited to go inside and see the actual film. The theater itself was changed slightly in the coming years to showcase yet another film. This new film would go by the name of Wonders of China, which, you guessed it, was about China. It was a film narrated by famous poet Li Bai as you were taken across the wonders of China. Obviously, the actual Li Bai was not voice acting, it was simply Key Luke doing a voiceover as the character, but nonetheless, the premise of the film was to simply showcase some history of China as well as some landmarks like the Great Wall. The Wonders of China was only around for 2 years, as in 1984, the Circle Vision Theater stopped showing this film in favor of yet another film, known as American Journeys. This one would have a longer lasting life, running for nearly 12 years, starting on July 4th, 1984 and ending on July 7th, 1996. This was not your typical American documentary though. This documentary tried its best to introduce other perspectives besides the typical white male that would lead these types of documentaries, instead opting to steer into the America is diverse theme. This would mark the last ever film to play in the Circle Vision Theater. Now, like a fair amount of other attractions on the Iceberg, this one was not entirely torn down. In fact, it was actually used as part of the Rocket Rods attraction, being used as part of the queue line. Of course, if you go to Disneyland today, you won't see any Circle Vision Theater there. But instead, what you should see in its place is everyone's favorite Space Ranger, the Buzz Lightyear Astro Blasters ride. This is what would occupy the space formerly known to be the Circle Vision Theater. Pack mules. Of all the rides on this list, this one is actually freaking hilarious. So if you remember from Layer 4, there was a ride called the Mine Train through Nature's Wonderland. That entire ride was basically a boring old train ride through a new area of the park that Walt Disney had entirely built to resemble a fictional Old West town. Now that ride was really cool and all, but what Walt Disney had lined up next in the 1960s was just wild. At least by Disney standards. For some reason, Disney thought it would be a fantastic idea to have a live animal attraction where the ride vehicle was an animal instead of a machine. Now, this idea wasn't crazy in and of itself, because if you go to like any local fair, there's definitely some type of animal ride, whether it's like you ride a pony or a horse, but this one was just on another level and it led to a lot of complications. Now, I will say on the surface and at the time, everything was basically perfect. Everything that Walt Disney had planned for this ride was going according to that plan. Not only did guests show a ton of interest in such an attraction, but the cost of maintenance was well below Disney's expectations. They purchased a herd of 75 mules for a mere $50 per head. And the reason they bought so many mules was to give each one a well-deserved break, as running this entire thing all day would be noticeably tiresome on the animals. Also, to feed the mules costed them nearly under 25 cents per head. So compare that to literally any other ride and it's very clear that this was a golden opportunity. Or so they thought. Unlike machines, real living things are unpredictable. For seemingly no reason, the mules would just stop moving, sometimes even opting to walk backwards, and obviously each guest had no idea what they were doing, so the guest's attempt to get the mule back on track would always just further piss off the mule and it would start going apeshit. Even with a trained mule skinner on deck at all times, there was always a ton of complications with this ride. From the mules not listening to straight up just screaming their ass off and giving off a loud series of brayings, which if you don't know, braying is this sound. I bet you didn't know that word, because I know I didn't. The mules would seemingly do this for almost no reason. I imagine it was due to the fact that they constantly had people riding their backs all day, but even then, we really don't know what these animals were thinking. This obviously ended up being a terrible idea, and to add insult to injury, this ride needed an e-ticket, which at this point you should know is the most expensive ticket for its time. Thankfully, this specific attraction was unique to Disneyland, and no one ever tried to duplicate this ride anywhere else. When I hear about stuff like this from Disney, it just shows how they have like absolutely no boundaries when it comes to finding what they might think is their next big business venture. Indian Village. The Indian Village is what used to occupy most of Frontierland. In 1956, Disney spent $100,000 designing a new area of the park for specifically Frontierland in lieu of the sudden interest in Indians during this time. This was most in part thanks to Western shows like Cowboys vs. Indians becoming very popular around this era. The Indian Village was made up of 4 distinct locations. There was the actual Indian Village, which featured full-blooded Indians. By the way, that's not my words, that's literally how it was advertised. Keep in mind that this was the 1950s, so a lot of this section will feel outdated as of now, just because a lot of what was seen as okay back then is definitely not okay now. As I was saying, these full-blooded Indians were live actors that would interact and talk to park guests as they came into the village. The idea here was for guests to get an authentic type of experience and actually learn and get taught about Indian culture. And despite the obvious bigotry here, it actually didn't do a terrible job of doing that. Another little pit stop before going in the big Indian Village was the Indian Trading Company, which most park goers should know about. If you've ever seen this little shop called the Westward Ho Trading Company, this is the exact same shop as the Indian Trading Company, except it's under a different name. The other 2 attractions during this time were the Indian War Canoes and the Fire Dance Circle. The Indian War Canoes were the predecessor to the Davy Crockett Explorer Canoes. If you've ever seen any canoes in Frontierland, it's essentially the same exact experience. Even the loading area for the most part remained unchanged throughout the years. The only real difference between these 2 specific rides was the boat design, but other than that, it was virtually the same guest experience. Now, the main attraction of this area was by far the Fire Dance Circle, as it was the main reason people would go to this area of the park. It featured 6 authentic tribal dances: the Omaha, the Shield and Spear, the Eagle, the Zuni Comanche, the Mountain Spirit, and the Friendship Dance. This specific attraction was also notable for being one of the best free-to-enter places in the entire park. Free entertainment for huge families, as the seating area for this was massive compared to most other shows at the park during this time. The Fire Dance Circle was a very involved show with park guests. If you were a child attending the show with your family, the dancers would often invite all of the children up to join them on stage for the Friendship Dance section. This ceremonial dance circle was honestly a real treat for guests, but the entire Indian Village was unfortunately overhauled in 1971 to make way for Bear Country, which over the next few years would slowly take over the entire area. The only remnants of the Indian Village are the Westward Ho Trading Company and the occasional standee or decoration, but there is no actual walk-in attraction that was kept during this transition. Stagecoach. If for some reason you don't know what a stagecoach is, it's one of these. A wagon type of vehicle being pulled by horses. What was invented as a means of practical travel eventually became outdated, and as such, Disney saw an opportunity for a cheap but effective attraction at the Disneyland park. Back then simply called the Stagecoach Ride, it opened as part of Disneyland's 1955 original lineup, as a member of the original roster of Frontierland attractions, and it was as basic of a ride as you can get. Guests would wait in this loading area, and once boarded, 4 horses would pull your stagecoach on a journey along the shore of the rivers of America and into the living desert. Once you were deep into the desert area of the park, it was remarkably easy to pretend that you were really traveling on a stagecoach through the open spaces of the Old West. A few changes would come in the near future though, with the biggest one coming the year after its debut. In 1956, some new scenery was added to the ride's original route, and it became the Rainbow Mountain Stagecoach Ride. Although this one took a bit bigger of a route, it was essentially the same ride when it came down to it. A simple stagecoach experience around the vast area of the Disney park. This is definitely one of the more shorter-lived experiences on this list, as it was closed in 1959, a mere 4 years after it debuted. It was closed due to the construction of Nature's Wonderland, which we all know would transform itself into what we know now today as the Mine Train through Nature's Wonderland. Now, although this ride is basically gone for good, if you were lucky enough to go to the parks in 2005, there's actually a huge chance that you saw this stagecoach standing out front of Big Thunder Ranch. In lieu of the 50th anniversary of Disneyland's opening, they brought back the original stagecoach used for this ride, albeit with a 50-year Mickey Mouse plaque placed right on top. Now we're not done with these stagecoach type rides yet, as the next entry on this list is very similar to the original stagecoach ride, Conestoga Wagons. The Conestoga Wagons could be found alongside the stagecoach ride in Frontierland around the same exact time period. Although it did not open with the park, it basically was a part of the original 1955 lineup, as it opened 1 month after Disneyland's original opening date. The only reason for it not opening on the original opening date of Disneyland is because of some complications that led to a not so smooth ride during the first day that it was supposed to open. The ride did its best to stay authentic to the type of wagon experience a pioneer heading to Oregon might be on. Guests would enter near the same location as the pack mule's loading area. The wagon will be pulled by 2 strong horses and guide you along the rivers of America and through the Rainbow Desert. Very similar to the pack mule's route. Now, in all seriousness, this wasn't an actual real depiction of what it might be like to experience going on a real Conestoga wagon. The biggest difference here being that people that actually used these wagons used them to store their possessions, not to actually ride in them. But besides this, it was actually a pretty cool attraction that I honestly would love to have there today, because there doesn't exist any type of old type of attraction like this at the parks right now. Nowadays, there's so much focus on the future and technology and what's to come next, and I honestly wish that we'd have more attractions at the Disneyland parks that would throw us back into history, much like the Abraham Lincoln attraction, or even some attractions like Big Thunder Mountain, which are like based on old-timey West vibes. Now, funny enough, this attraction still lived on even after it closed in 1959. And in a weird turn of events, it became part of a McDonald's pop-up stand, nicknamed the Conestoga Fries. This spot opened up in 1998 at almost the exact same spot where you would originally board the ride. Unfortunately, this also didn't last too long, as in 2008, the McDonald's brand was removed from basically everywhere in the park, and although most places just simply rebranded their menu, the Conestoga Wagon Fries were taken out completely. The Westward Ho name only lives on in the aforementioned Westward Ho Trading Company. Mickey Mouse Club Circus. The Mickey Mouse Club Circus debuted in November 24th of 1955. It was a 3-ring circus that featured Professor Keller and his fantastic felines, which you should know from earlier, Sarando the Wonder Horse, Bob O the Disney Clown, and the Mouseketeers from TV's Mickey Mouse Club. The cool thing about this attraction was that the circus was advertised in the parks in the form of a parade that would end with circus floats waiting at the front of the circus's entrance. The entire production was actually really well done. Walt Disney tried to be as authentic as possible with everything. Professional circus people, authentic circus wagons, and of course, the awesome circus tent. It was advertised to have animal acts, aerialists, elephants, and clowns all set to perform for guests. The entire attraction would perform twice a day, and as stated before, each show would start as a parade in Main Street, USA, with all of the circus talent running all the way down Main Street, ending up at the front of the circus tent. You did not use a typical A to E ticket to get into this ride. You actually had to purchase an entirely separate admission ticket to get into the Mickey Mouse Club Circus. But once you actually bought your ticket and were seated inside, it was a classic circus show. All of this sounded great to park guests, and it truly was. However, there were some issues with this attraction, as I've said before. For one, it was extremely hot. As you'd expect, a tent with pretty much no air conditioning at the time would reach abnormally high temperatures, which would make watching the show pretty damn hard. Number 2, the ticket to get in was not part of the regular ticket system, as you would need to buy an entirely separate ticket just to get on this one ride. But if you wanted to get on any other attraction, you would simply buy an A to E ticket booklet, and you had a basically free range choice to go on whatever you wanted, whereas this ride would lock you into going on only this attraction. Why this was done, I have no idea, but this definitely contributed as to why this attraction wasn't as popular, as you would need to buy an entirely separate ticket just for this attraction. And let's be honest, if you were taking your kid to Disneyland, what would you do? buy another ticket for this entirely separate attraction from the park that's sweaty and hot, or buy an A to E ticket book and enjoy the rest of the Disney park. Seems like a pretty obvious choice to me. This leads me to my third issue. The circus as an idea just wasn't something that guests wanted to do. Despite the amazing acrobatics and showmanship of the Mickey Mouse Club Circus, it was pretty common to see the entire circus tent half empty during each show. Walt Disney was also said to be extremely unhappy with how the circus performers conducted themselves behind scenes. It's been stated that on multiple occasions, Walt would frequently catch them drinking and gambling after each show. However, the biggest reason by far for the show's swift cancellation is because it was just a circus. You have to remember, the main draw to going to Disneyland is for a unique experience that you can't get anywhere else, and nothing about the Mickey Mouse Club Circus separated itself from any of the other circuses that you could enjoy around the Orange County area. It's like I was saying earlier, why would you take your kid to see a regular plain old circus when you have Disneyland in its backyard? For this reason, the show did completely disappear, as the entire production was scrapped in 1956, a measly 1 year after the circus debuted. Toy Story Funhouse. The original Toy Story Funhouse debuted in January of 1996 and replaced what was then known as Mission to Mars. The Funhouse was part of a Toy Story overhaul that Disney wanted on Tomorrowland as part of the recent release of Toy Story 1. The Toy Story Funhouse and the Toy Story famous Pizza Planet were added to the Tomorrowland as a way to cash in on Toy Story's success. From what footage still exists of this place, it appears that it was meant to have the same effect that Bugs Land had on people. Where Bugs Land wanted people to feel as small as a bug, the Toy Story Funhouse sought to make you feel as small as a toy. Complete with a giant-sized recreation of Andy's bedroom, kids could interact with Woody, Buzz, and the entire gang of toys from the movie. Now, the main attraction or draw to this place was definitely the outside show. The outside show was named Ham's All Doll Revue, in which characters would sing and dance to gather crowds. It was nothing more than the typical Disneyland performance that you would expect. Although it's listed as the main attraction for the Funhouse, it was done outside of the premises, and I personally think that the other stuff you could do on the inside is definitely why kids would want to go to this attraction. Inside the Funhouse, there were character meet and greets, a 2-step dance lesson with Woody, a Green Army Men obstacle course, a jumbo light bright play wall, and in the same vein, a spirograph play wall. Unlike many of the other attractions that were taken out on this list, this one was actually put into Disneyland with the full intention of it being temporary. Disney simply wanted to capitalize on the success of Toy Story during this time and used these attractions as a way to bring in park guests until they could think of something better to do with the area. This is actually insane because the entire land was intended to be temporary, but it was a smash hit with park guests. Even with it doing so well in the first few months that it was open, Disney was hard pressed on getting it out as soon as possible. Just before the busy summer of 1996, the same year that the Funhouse opened, Disney closed the entire attraction to make way for what would become Red Rocket's Pizza Port, which we all know would later become the Alien Pizza Planet in 2018. I honestly don't know what it is about Disney taking out like super cool attractions, because although I didn't get to experience the Toy Story Funhouse myself, I could definitely see younger me enjoying it today. You know, first, the Innovention Center, and now I learned about this. It's just freaking crazy that I feel like every time Disney has some type of smash hit at their parks, they're just very quick to get rid of it. As I said before, I didn't even know about this one, but it looks like a hell of a good time for a kid. That is, if you were into Toy Story at all. Old DCA Negative Emotional Aura. Okay, so this one isn't technically an attraction, but the moment that I read this, I immediately understood what exactly the original Reddit poster was trying to get across with this entry. I believe this is in reference to the sheer atmosphere that there was when you would first walk into the original Disneyland California Adventure Park when it opened all those years ago. Even as a child, going from Disneyland with the awesome Main Street music and the pop and parades to just sheer emptiness, it felt off. It was weird because, I mean, in the back of your head, you knew you were technically at Disneyland still and you should be like super upbeat and happy, but the entire park just did not feel like Disney. California Adventure was not something that kids would think of when you heard the word Disneyland. It was something that you think of when you heard the word like local fair. It never truly felt like something that Disney put out with all their efforts. From the weird sun icon to the strange theater attractions that were frequent in this area of the park, nothing about it screamed Disneyland. And instead it felt more like you were at some weird theme park that happened to have some Disney memorabilia in the gift shops and loose connections to California. By the way, this is no disrespect to the old DCA, because as I've said in the other videos, I actually really like what the original California Adventure sought to do. An entire park designed around California's biggest landmarks. It's a really original idea, but it just never felt like a Disney idea. It felt like it could have been done somewhere else. I mean, the entrance was simply iconic with the postcard look, but something about the original design and layout of the park just never felt like it quite fit right into the Disneyland formula. I imagine this is why now the park strays away from the original design of being a California themed park in favor of being a more Disney themed park. At the time of DCA's debut, there was only 16 attractions in the entire park, and half of them were sit-down shows or some type of cheap walkthrough entertainment, which was in drastic contrast to Disneyland, with well over double the amount of attractions and rides ranging from fast-paced thrillers like Space Mountain to more chill rides like Autopia or the storybook canal boats. And not only that, but the theming, the sound, and just the general atmosphere of being at Disneyland was almost always way better than the original California Adventure. And this is most likely why this is on this list. Again, this isn't a concrete idea, it's more just something that I personally can relate to, and obviously the creator of this Iceberg can relate to. If you got a chance to go to the original California Adventure before it got remodeled in the late 2010s, let me know in the comments below if you guys kind of understand what exactly this entry is going for. Tomorrowland Exhibits. This was a lot harder to find information on than a lot of the other entries on this list, and it's because it was one of the least documented attractions at Disneyland. When Tomorrowland debuted at the Disneyland Resort, there was only 3 actual rides that guests could go on: the Rocket Rods, the infamous boat ride, and Autopia. The rest of this area in the park was very empty, which left Walt Disney with no choice but to try and find something to fill the space in order to make the park feel more full. This would ultimately make the park feel like a less fun thing to do and more like an expensive ad showcase. The Hall of Chemistry and the Aluminum Hall of Fame were exhibits that were shoehorned into Tomorrowland in order to better fill up the area and also keep guests happy with the state of the park. Let's start with the Aluminum Hall of Fame. The attraction was a walkthrough attraction that would allow guests to learn of the wonders of aluminum, seeing such things as the Kaiser aluminum pig, nicknamed Cap. It's said that there was a way for guests to interact with Cap and somehow mold him into certain shapes, but it's unclear how exactly guests would do this. The brochure just says guests could change his shape. Now, the other attraction, the Monsanto Hall of Chemistry, was very similar to the aluminum counterpart, only this time taking guests through the wonders of how chemistry worked and how these 8 materials were used to create nearly 500 different chemicals. It also explained how Monsanto became the powerhouse that it was during this time. The first thing in this exhibit was the Chematron, which was like 8 huge tubes arranged in a circle that contained one of 8 of the most commonly used materials in the world. There was also another part of this exhibit called the Fashions and Fabrics Through the Ages. Here, you could see how the materials were used to create clothing, while of course maintaining the scientific discourse. Now, it's unclear when exactly these attractions were replaced, but they were basically placeholder attractions during this time because they weren't meant to be anything more than just a simple ad showcase. Again, Disney has a huge pattern of doing this with a lot of their old parks. They would basically get a huge sponsor, slap it on a ride, and call it a day. And that's what these 2 exhibits were. Viewliner. The Viewliner was the name given to the first futuristic monorail type attraction at the Disney parks. The Viewliner was inspired by GM's at the time new project, the Aero Train, which was meant to give a fresh and modern look to locomotives. Disney absolutely ran with this idea, taking apart a 1954 and 1956 Oldsmobile and merging them together to create the signature look for the front of what would become the Viewliner train. The Viewliner debuted in June of 1957, just shy of 2 years after Disneyland's opening. It was advertised as being the railroad experience of tomorrow and also a neat way to see the views that Tomorrowland offered. What was really cool about this attraction was that there was 2 different stations you could use to hop aboard. There was one station in Tomorrowland and one in Fantasyland. This was not like how the train works today though, with you being able to get off at either station. Each station had their own designated figure 8 track around the park that had its own separate train. So you could not go on the Fantasyland train and end up at the Tomorrowland train. There was basically 2 separate rides that were the same exact experience, only they would go around different areas of the park. The Tomorrowland train had an orange theme, with each passenger car being named after a different planet, and the Fantasyland train was blue, with its passenger cars being named after various Disney characters. The ride was a simple train ride around Tomorrowland and Fantasyland and wasn't much more than that. It was just one of those chill rides you'd most likely get on after you've had a super long day at the park and you just want somewhere to sit down. And seeing as it only required a B ticket, which was one of the lowest tier tickets, it was a smash hit when it debuted at the Disneyland parks. But much like the Toy Story Funhouse, this attraction was a quick band-aid on the Disneyland resort, only used to fill up space for the time being. Trains were the easiest and cheapest attraction Walt Disney could get his hands on, and thus the Viewliner came out as a result. This one ran through from June 10th, 1957 all the way to September 30th of 1958. Just a year and a few months, making it one of the most short-lived attractions in the park's history. The ride was replaced by, funny enough, the Disneyland monorail in the summer of the following year. This also brought along the Matterhorn bobsleds and the Submarine Voyage, and although it's not one of the most impressive rides on this list, it definitely lives on in the heart of Disney fans, seeing as the monorail clearly took inspiration from its predecessor, Hollywood-Maxwell's Intimate Apparel Shop. Hollywood-Maxwell's Intimate Apparel Shop, otherwise known as the Wizard of Bras, was a rather obscure attraction at the Disneyland parks, and definitely not something that you would see today. The store was a Victorian-style shop that sold all types of bras, underwear, and petticoats that were available in 1955. You heard that right. There was a store on good old Main Street, USA that sold, for lack of a better term, lingerie, or as it was called during this time, intimate clothing. The Intimate Apparel Shop, as it was known, featured a character known as the Wizard of Bras. Now, this wasn't just a store to shop in, as by now you must realize most of Disneyland during its early years was mainly sponsored walkthrough attractions with loose ties to Disney. And this store was no exception. This one was sponsored by Hollywood-Maxwell, which was a company that manufactured this type of intimate apparel. In this sponsored attraction, the Wizard of Bras would take you throughout the history of women's undergarments and explain the stages of dresses and clothing. During its time, tons of articles made their way, explaining how men were afraid to enter due to their wives wanting to hide such risque themes from their husbands. The actual experience in the store wasn't what you might expect though. Half of the shop was made to look like a Victoria-era receiving room. There was a fireplace, a big old sofa, and old-fashioned drapes and other alike items. The other half of the store was a simple lingerie-style store selling the advertised bras and other undergarments to women. There's a specific bra that I wanted to mention called the Vet Whirlpool Bra, and I'm not going to show a picture of it just because I really don't want to give YouTube a reason to demonetize this video, but it's nothing too risque if I'm being completely honest. But the fact that it was 1955, literally any type of bra that wasn't covering like half of your entire body was considered super risque and promiscuous. And this one is just absolutely ridiculous. It just looks like 2 huge triangles sitting on a woman's chest, and I just cannot get over the fact that this was considered risque during this time. The Intimate Apparel Shop did not last too long though, as it was closed a mere half year after it opened. In January 1956, the shop was in fact closed, and for good reason. Disney realized that their target audience was not the ones that were going into the store. This store was meant to draw in adults and obviously have women purchase a lot of lingerie type of wear, but instead a lot of teenagers were the ones seen frequenting the shop, often being accompanied by laughter and giggles as these kids saw the Wizard of Bras explaining the entire risque experience to them. If you're wondering where exactly on Main Street did the shop used to stand, it's this house right here. This area with the porch is where the old Wizard of Bras attractions used to stand. It's pretty wild that Disney even thought this was a good idea, but it just goes to show how different times were, and even may show a little desperation on Disney's part to fill up this area of the park. If any of you have learned anything from watching this iceberg, it's that Disneyland in 1955 is not all that special. I think a lot of people think that Disney is going way too far today with trying to appease these ads and sponsors in the park, but it was so much worse during the early years. You know, such blatant ad placement and sponsors that only had attractions for their specific name. It was a way worse time, and it's obviously so cool to look back on now, but I can't even imagine what park experience was like back then. So the next two entries on this list, I actually could not find any information on them. The two entries next were supposed to be the photograph cutouts outside Disneyland and the DCA weird shops and restaurants. Now the photograph cutouts outside Disneyland, I have like absolutely zero idea like what that's supposed to mean. I have like no clue. I've looked up so many things and I just cannot find any kind of like concrete idea as to what it is. I think it has to do with this like kind of thing that happened where people would take pictures and post themselves out front of the park, and there was these big murals made up of different photograph cutouts from people, but I don't know if that's specifically what's being referenced here, because from the sound of it, it sounds like there was weird Disney cutouts that people could take pictures with in the front. I personally have no idea though. And the next one, DCA weird shops and restaurants, I'm like almost 100% certain this one's in reference to the old California themed restaurants that used to be in DCA, but there might be some other stuff in reference to this. I really don't know. If you guys have any idea what these two are in reference to, let me know in the comments, because I actually have like absolutely zero idea what these are supposed to be. This will bring us to Layer 7. Now Layer 7 is mostly contrived of rides and attractions that never made it past the concept stage. And if they did make it past the concept stage, they failed absolutely miserably. I'm going to call this layer the dreams that never came true. Rock Candy Mountain. Rock Candy Mountain was a scrapped idea at the Disneyland Resort that was supposed to open alongside the original lineup in 1955. The concept for this ride was fucking dope, and I think it would have made an absolute great addition to the Disneyland parks. It was supposed to take place atop a ginormous candy mountain made up of lollipops and rock candy. And even crazier, the ride was supposed to be actually made of real candy in some areas. I don't know if that part's actually true, it's just something I read online. I think it's fake, but we'll just assume it's real for this part. The concept art shows that the scenery was mostly made up of these beautifully colored and dyed waterfalls all around the mountains, huge lollipops, piles of candy, all accompanied by sweet smelling aromas, topped off with a birthday cake candle at the very top. All this would be happening on the outside as guests made their way into the cave onto the other side. Now, what exactly was on the other side of this cave? Emerald City. Straight out of the Wizard of Oz story, guests would find themselves in an elaborate and beautiful scene created and inspired by L. Frank Baum's original Oz books. Now you're probably sitting here wondering like, why is Walt Disney trying to create a Wizard of Oz ride? And it's because during that time period, Walt Disney had just purchased the rights to all of the original Oz books, and he was intending on making a new debut ride that had Wizard of Oz at the very center. Guests would make their way to Emerald City for Dorothy's birthday party, where she would enjoy her time with her friends from Oz. This looked like it could have been something amazing. Now, very little concept art exists for this ride, and in fact, I'm showing what I believe to be the only concept art floating around the internet. It's clear that a lot of thought was put into this, and inside the mountain was going to have a ton of scenes from the Oz books. The main purpose of the inside of the mountain was to promote Walt Disney's upcoming movie, The Rainbow Road to Oz, which is still an unreleased Wizard of Oz film that was to continue the original Oz storyline. As such, there's a lot of ties from the ride to the unreleased movies. The team went as far as making these 3D models of some potential scenes in the ride, such as this one. It's unclear where this would be in the attraction, but I imagine guests would ride in a circle around this area as they got a chance to look at the grand scene laid out for them. Obviously, we know this ride never made it past the concept stage as it doesn't exist at all in any form at the Disneyland parks, but there's no real reason why. The wiki page and other sources state that Walt felt as though the ride would look unappealing and perhaps make riders feel physically ill. But there isn't ever any sources that cite him saying that, they just kind of say that he said that. So if it's true or not, I don't know, I'm just going to trust these as that's the only source that I basically have for this. The Matterhorn bobsleds are what would replace the Rock Candy Mountain concept, and we know that the bobsleds would ultimately be what Walt Disney decided to have in the park. Now don't be too upset, as there is a tiny shop in California Adventure that showcases a small but really cool replica, or I guess diorama, of what the original Rock Candy Mountain could have looked like. Superstar Limo. This ride is probably the most infamous ride among the defunct Disneyland attractions. This attraction sat exactly where the Mike and Sully to the Rescue ride sits today. Superstar Limo would debut alongside Disney's California Adventure as one of the premier rides for guests. Now that premiere is an asterisk because this ride was just all around a terrible experience, from the line queue to the creepy looking puppets, the weird cameos from celebrities, and just an all around just strange experience for park guests. Now every ride at Disneyland has some kind of story to guide it along, and this ride is no exception. Now to give the ride some credit, because I do think that the ride could have been a good ride had it been done correctly, the attraction that we actually got versus the one that was planned are different. The ride that was planned was to put guests in a limo with the then CEO of Disney, Michael Eisner, giving you a mission. Your mission was to get you to the big premiere at the Chinese theater to sign a contract for your next big movie. On the way there, you were to avoid the press and crazed fans that were eager to get a scoop on you. Originally set to take the form of a high-speed chase that would end with you at the Chinese theater and serve as a gift shop / unloading area. Trust me, this idea is a lot better than what we actually got. This idea was mostly scrapped after the tragic limo crash of 1997 that caused the death of Princess Diana of Wales. Disney thought the concept in its entirety would be in very poor taste just because of the fact that it was a little bit related to this death, and as such it was shelved. However, Disney still needed a top headliner attraction for California Adventure, and it was suggested that what if they just did a more slow and tame version of Superstar Limo, with more emphasis on celebrity cameos and Hollywood inside jokes. This would lead to Disney haphazardly getting the rights to really cheap celebrities to make cameos on this ride. Also, the idea of Michael Eisner, the CEO, giving guests their mission was scrapped and replaced with a generic sleazy Hollywood agent character. If you were unlucky enough to go on the ride yourself, you would walk yourself all the way to the far corner of Hollywoodland where Superstar Limo's entrance could be seen. You'd arrive at baggage claim at LAX, and a pre-show with the puppet version of Joan Rivers would broadcast the news, claiming a new Hollywood sensation was going to be a big star, referring to the guests riding the attraction, of course. Once you board the limo, the built-in picture phone would ring and your agent would begin explaining what exactly is going on. You were to come to the Chinese theater for your big movie premiere. Sounds pretty similar to the original ride idea, but when the ride starts, you'd see it's nothing like what the original ride was planned to do. The rest of the ride from that point on was essentially a scenic tour of Los Angeles where you'd spot a ton of weird and creepy puppet versions of celebrities. The first room was guests making their way through Beverly Hills. Regis Philbin would pop out of this room, scaring the guests. Melanie Griffith with Antonio Banderas holding what appears to be milkshakes would greet parkgoers as they slowly made their way towards the next celebrity cameo. Cindy Crawford, who was kind of just awkwardly placed in front of whatever the hell this is. The next scene was the Sunset Strip where Tim Allen and Jackie Chan made appearances. The ride would then put guests in a dark tunnel where your picture phone would light up once again, with your agent reminding you not to be late. Next up was Drew Carey, randomly holding a bunch of maps. Then you'd get to another tunnel and your agent would call, and you'd encounter Cher, who doesn't even face the park guests half the time. Nearing the end of the ride, you would enter the studio lots, where paparazzi and cheap production assistants would scare you. What was bizarre about this section was how every person in the ride thus far was a physical 3D character, and all of a sudden the crowd and paparazzi are now made of these like super cheap cardboard cutouts. The finale would have you arriving for the premiere, being greeted by world-renowned Whoopi Goldberg. The ride would then show a photo of yourselves before entering the last tunnel, ending with your agent exclaiming how you are now a big superstar. Now, when the ride debuted, it was almost immediately met with horrible backlash, with regular park goers talking about how trash the ride was, and they wasted hours waiting in line for like the most boring and overhyped ride they have the entire Disneyland experience. Everyone hated this ride, like almost everyone that went on it, even like the people that went on it and were supposed to advertise the ride. There's like news sections of popular celebrities going on the ride, and you can clearly tell that they're not really enjoying it themselves either. It's just all around is a terrible attraction. Nearly 1 year after it opened, it was closed, and it was replaced by the much better Mike and Sully to the rescue. Tomorrowland 2055. Tomorrowland 2055 is one of the most ambitious things that I have heard, at least coming from a more Disney perspective. It was a drawn-up concept in the early 1990s, and the entire thing was created by Tony Baxter. Baxter had previously created the famous Discoveryland that debuted in Disneyland Paris, and Discoveryland was such a huge success and was met with such positive reception from park goers that Disney tasked Tony Baxter with transforming Southern California's Tomorrowland into something special. Baxter and his team wanted to create a timeless version of the future. Sounds kind of weird, but the theme they settled on was to transform Tomorrowland into an intergalactic spaceport. The story the Imagineers were going to go with was that during the construction of Tomorrowland 2055, giant pulsating crystals were uncovered that, when exposed to sunlight, sent a direct beacon that drew aliens from outer space to the Disneyland park. And so, Tomorrowland was designed to be a huge spaceport for all types of intergalactic beings. Now, to really create a timeless version of this concept, the Imagineers went and put all their energy into developing a retro future, a look into the future from the perspective of the past. Cyberpunk and Art Deco would heavily influence the project, as you can see from the concept art. To help guests fully immerse into the concept of Tomorrowland 2055, tons of the land would have some kind of story tie into it, from stores having aliens work in them to a very elaborate parade. The parade, in fact, was actually crazy. If this was actually done, it'd probably be one of the most famous parades at any park ever. Before each parade would happen, a routine pre-show would start, and this was so freaking cool. Emergency sirens would start blasting all over Disneyland, announcing that an alien spaceship had been spotted. Guests would be directed to a UFO in the sky that would land in the near distance behind one of the show buildings. Right as the UFO was out of sight and supposedly landed, aliens would burst out dancing along Tomorrowland and form into a parade. The entire area would also include a second story where guests could explore the park through various bridges and catwalks. This would also help sell the illusion of a bustling urban intergalactic city from the future. Now, someone by the name of Rob Yeo Design took the liberty of bringing these concepts into full-blown 3D, and that's what I'm showing you guys on screen right now. This is what the main area of the park could have looked like. You even got the Art Deco style PeopleMover vehicles, which I think are pretty cool. The entrance to the planned alien encounter ride that would eventually end up at Magic Kingdom in Florida, and the main building of Tomorrowland, which would have been Flik 2's fantastic intergalactic review. Unlike some of the other concepts, this one was shelved due to outside factors. CEO Michael Eisner bet a lot of money that Disneyland Paris would succeed way beyond anyone's imagination. And because of how poorly that park performed, when it was made, it caused Disney to make budget cuts basically everywhere. So Tomorrowland 2055 was never built and was put on the shelves to basically die. But don't be too disappointed, as Disney has a history of putting old ideas away and bringing them back when the time is right. So even though we don't have it right now, you never know. It's not outside the realm of possibilities for Disney to create a 2055 inspired Tomorrowland in the near future. Light Magic. Light Magic was a parade that would replace the good old Main Street Electrical Parade. I did talk about this one in the earlier parts of this iceberg, so you should know of this parade, but it was very short-lived and it was really hard to follow up the nighttime spectacle that was the Main Street Electrical Parade. What's crazy about the Light Magic show is that Disney pulled out all the stops. It costed them nearly $20 million. They went so hard for this show, only for it to flop fucking bad. It's like, this is like one of the worst showings of like a parade at Disneyland in the history of parades there. What's crazy is that Disney went absolutely hard for the show. Like they went so hard for the show. They spent almost $20 million trying to produce it, and they pulled out all the stops. They upped the paid performers from 80 dancers to 140. They made floats nearly twice as big with these elegant fairy and pixie designs. They even went as far as to do construction right outside of It's a Small World to give more space for park guests to watch the parade. They were absolutely convinced that this show was going to be a smash hit. They went through all of these like hoops and loops and trying to make this one of the biggest shows that you've ever seen, and it just failed so hard. And it's funny too, because Mike Davis, who is one of Disneyland's chief of entertainment, said in an interview for the parade, "We hope it's the longest lasting show in the history of show business." Disney bet big on this, and it clearly showed with not only the production of it, but the marketing as well. They created these interactive press kits where guests would receive a CD that would give a virtual glimpse into the nighttime show. It included clips of Light Magic's construction, interviews with executives, and snippets of the soundtrack. To hopefully give more hype to the entire parade, Disney even hosted a sneak peek of the show for $25 a pop. But it was only offered to annual pass holders at the time, so it was a little bit exclusive. People came and Light Magic was unveiled for the very first time, and to Disney's surprise, and I guess everyone's surprise, the show was trash. It was not received well at all. People hated it. They claimed that it was confusing and there was no cohesive story, and it was just generally said to just be a huge waste of time. You might be scratching your head wondering how it's possible the show failed this hard, because Disney put like all of this work into it. But if you actually sit and watch the show, it's pretty apparent as to why it failed. For a good parade, at least in my opinion, you need either a super cool concept like with the Disney's Goofy Parade that took you through the history of the world through Goofy's eyes, or you need something so spectacular and eye-catching that guests' monkey brains like flip on and they're just in awe over how amazing your creation is, like with the Main Street Electrical Parade. Light Magic tried to do both and failed at both spectacularly. The story, if you can even call it that, was these fairies waking up for no reason, dancing with various Disney characters, and then a storm comes out of nowhere to interrupt the parade, with Tinkerbell saving the day with some pixie dust. Then more dancing would ensue. A projected sequence of some sort would follow, then you'd get some mediocre drumming and more dancing. The main issue with the Light Magic Parade was that Disney tried really hard to recreate the success of the Electrical Parade. But what made the Main Street Electrical Parade the success that it was the fun music, the matching strobe lights, and the overall simplicity but easy to follow choreography. Disney just tried way too hard to create the Electrical Parade Part 2 bigger and better, and ended up creating something that took away from what made the predecessor so special. The music was complicated with Celtic influenced music intertwined with Disney classics. The floats were really huge with like nothing striking about them. And to me, the entire parade, I thought at least, looked like one giant float instead of a bunch of separate floats, which makes it really hard on my eyes to figure out where to focus. And also, the parade was hyped up way too much. I imagine if Disney hadn't gone so hard on the marketing and didn't try to convince audiences it was the best thing since sliced bread, it might have actually done okay. It might still have disappointed people because of how awesome the Main Street Electrical Parade was, but it probably wouldn't have been the biggest flop as it was if they didn't go so freaking hard on trying to convince everyone that it was the best thing ever. Westcott. A huge difference between Walt Disney World and Disneyland is the sheer size of both parks. I mean, if you want to take a vacation and experience all that Walt Disney World has to offer, it's almost like expected that you're supposed to spend an entire week at Walt Disney World in order to see everything that's there. While in vast contrast, I'd argue that if you get lucky enough with fast pass times and crowd size, you could experience almost everything in Disneyland and California Adventure in the span of one day. This is where Westcott would have come in. Westcott was the lost expansion of the 1990s. This was supposed to take the Disneyland Resort from just a 1 or 2 day experience to a full-on week-long ride. Taking clear inspiration from Epcot, Westcott would feature a main iconic building that would be called Space Station Earth, a 300-foot golden version of Spaceship Earth from Epcot in Florida. Quite ambitious, seeing as Spaceship Earth, the original, was 180 feet tall. So Space Station Earth would not only tower over its predecessor, but it would be the tallest building in all of Orange County, at least during this time. Spaceship Earth would house a new attraction titled Cosmic Journeys, which was to be an updated version of Adventure Through Inner Space. Much like its Florida counterpart, Westcott was supposed to have its own world showcase and its own take on Future World. Future World at Westcott was supposed to have 3 pavilions: the Wonders of Living, the Wonders of Space, and the Wonders of Earth. There was also planned to be an updated version of Journey into Imagination, which is a defunct ride from Walt Disney World. Ultimately, this expansion would have been awesome, but obviously we know this doesn't exist, as unfortunately it was cancelled before it could be built. Now, there was a ton of issues with Westcott when it was trying to come out. For one, there was no way for Disney to easily acquire enough land for the entire expansion. They needed well over 100 acres of land, and they were going to try and get it from tons of various business owners from around the area, and that was just so the project could be passed on to the next stage. It's not even if the project is going to be finalized or anything. They just needed to have this land just so they could even get into the next process of trying to build Westcott. Also, the citizens of Anaheim were not happy about the idea. They thought it would bring way too much traffic to an already busy area, and everyone thought that Westcott's Space Station Earth would just be nothing but an eyesore on Anaheim's cityscape. The nail in the coffin for Westcott was the infamous Euro Disney failure, which forced a lot of the Disney parks to move budgets around in order to make up for the huge loss that was Disneyland Paris. So in 1995, the entire thing was shelved. Shocking. This story does have somewhat of a happy ending though. Although it's not what Disney really wanted for the Disneyland Resort in SoCal, they did kind of get an expansion because they ended up revamping the entire California Adventure. They added Star Wars Land and Downtown Disney to make the resort feel a lot more full than it was before. It's honestly crazy how much we would have at all the Disney parks had Euro Disney done so well. Like, Euro Disney single-handedly got like so many of Tony Baxter's projects shut down, and a lot of the projects on this list, and specifically in Layer 7, are all basically Euro Disney's fault for not coming to fruition. So I feel like there's so much rides that got canceled just due to this one park failing so hard. Discovery Bay. Discovery Bay is an unbuilt land designed by Tony Baxter in the late 1970s. You'll notice a lot of these planned lands were created by Tony Baxter, and it's because he was honestly just really freaking good at his job. Discovery Bay would have been nothing short of amazing if it actually existed. Prior to the conception of this land, Disney was trying to figure out what to do with Frontierland, as in the 1980s, when this problem arose, Frontierland was just not up to date. It was basically a glorified land built all around one single attraction, which was the mine trains through Nature's Wonderland. Discovery Bay was Disney's attempt to revamp and overhaul the entirety of Frontierland into something that guests could actually be excited about. This is one of Disney's more fleshed out concepts, as there were a ton of attractions planned for Discovery Bay. Journey into Imagination would be an attraction similar to America Sings or the Carousel of Progress. It would start with Professor Marvel and his baby dragon as they showed you all of his neat inventions for the future. You could also board the Nautilus and the Hyperion airship, which were two iconic pieces set to be the main eye-catchers of Discovery Bay. There was also very unique rides created, like the Fireworks Factory, which was to be a ride that I imagine would function similar to Toy Story Mania or the Web Slingers ride. In this one, guests would launch fireworks among the factory's assembly line. One of my personal favorites of the Lost rides was a hot air balloon attraction that would function similar to that of the Skyway ride. It would be a simple transportation attraction that would take guests in the sky aboard hot air balloons and drop them off near the Dumbo ride in Fantasyland. Disney was ready to go all out with Discovery Bay, as they even produced a movie specifically for the land called The Island at the Top of the World. Disney hoped that the movie would perform well and would draw guests into the park to experience the movie in real life. All these attractions were just a small sliver of what would make up Discovery Bay, and the only reason we never got this one was actually not because of Euro Disney. It was because of the public. Not only did the island at the top of the world drastically underperform, but this was around the time that science fiction and action adventure movies were what was getting the limelight. Disney parkgoers didn't want fantasy adventure or old western themes, they wanted Star Wars in the future. So Disney shifted their focus towards other parts of the Disneyland resort, and slowly but surely, Discovery Bay just stopped being talked about as much as when it was first created. This isn't a situation where there was like one single reason as to why this land didn't get built. It's just one of those rare occasions where something really awesome was just made at the wrong place at the wrong time. Liberty Street and Edison Square. I'm lumping these two together because although they're not technically connected story-wise, they were developed around the same time and would technically be placed almost right next to each other. I've already talked about Edison Square before when I talked about the Carousel of Progress. Edison Square was a planned expansion to Main Street, USA, and it was supposed to be dedicated to electricity and the history of Thomas Edison's discovery. The main attraction of Edison Square was GE's Harnessing the Lightning. It was going to be a 4-act show that would follow the average American family throughout 4 different time periods of life. The main point of this ride was to showcase the possible use of electricity and its impact on the average American family in the coming future. As for the rest of the park, they were to be filled with interactive experiences all themed around harnessing the lightning. This addition to Disneyland did not get too far past the concept phase, as Disney had its attention set on the monorail, the Matterhorn bobsleds, and the Submarine Voyage. And even though Edison Square was technically shelved, the idea for the main attraction, Harnessing the Lightning, would be transformed into the idea later known as the Carousel of Progress. The other addition set to be at Disneyland was Liberty Street, or otherwise known as International Street. This addition to Main Street was actually set to be an entire land expansion, originally dubbed International Land, but it was quickly shortened down to just a small extension to Main Street, USA that would allow guests to experience the streets and shops of Europe. However, due to how ambitious this was, Walt Disney realized this wouldn't really be doable because of how small the land was set to be. So he changed International Street to Liberty Street. And so, Liberty Street was set to open in 1958. There was a banner up for everything. You could peep in and actually get sneak peeks of what Liberty Street was going to be. It was a real actual thing that was going to be made. And this time, instead of being a recreation of Europe, it would be a recreation of colonial America around 1775. Think walking around the streets of America during the Boston Tea Party. The land would feature shops and blacksmiths, a recreation of Griffin's Wharf where the Boston Tea Party took place, and of course the main attraction that the land would lead up to, Liberty Square, featuring the Liberty Tree accompanied by many other exhibits and shops. And at the end of the entire expansion was Liberty Hall and the Hall of the Declaration of Independence. There was even supposed to be an entire show about the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and it was going to be based around, I think it was 4 paintings around that time period, but not much is really known and a lot of it's kind of just hearsay. Nonetheless, these two would have actually been, I would say, pretty cool because I personally really like the Abraham Lincoln attraction show at Disneyland. And I feel like these would have been very nice touches on the entire thing, but it does come off a little nationalistic in my opinion. Atlantis Expedition. Atlantis Expedition would have greatly expanded on the already existing Submarine Voyage. During the early 2000s, the movie Atlantis: The Lost Empire was in deep development, and Disney thought it would be fitting to have a ride themed around the new animated movie. And so, the Atlantis Expedition was created. It would have featured a massive volcano that the monorail would have driven straight through, and would have had much of the scenery around the area changed to better fit the Atlantis theme. Now, based on the concept art and what I've read, I believe this ride would have operated similar to that of the rafts to Tom Sawyer's Island, with guests taking a submarine to Atlantis and being able to get off the submarine and explore the lost city themselves. Much like the other additions on the Iceberg, this would have created something so different than what we've seen at Disney before. The main reason this attraction never happened was because Disney relied, or rather hoped, that the success of the Atlantis film would be enough to fund the Atlantis Expedition expansion. Sadly, the movie did not reach anywhere near the success that Disney had hoped for, and as such, the entire thing was scrapped, leaving the Submarine Voyage to rot until it was later rethemed into the Finding Nemo ride. Geyser Mountain. Geyser Mountain was to be the first turbo drop coaster at Disneyland. Now before I move on, if there's any kiddos watching this, or if someone just genuinely doesn't know what a drop coaster is, it's one of those rides where you get launched straight into the air, only to come plummeting straight down. Some famous ones are Supreme Scream at Knott's Berry Farm, Lex Luthor's Drop, and of course the Tower of Terror. Geyser Mountain would have functioned very similarly to these types of rides. During the mid-1990s, after Disney started recovering from the financial failure that was Disneyland Paris, they began revamping the entirety of the Disneyland Resort. And in doing the revamp planning, they realized that Frontierland hadn't gotten a new ride since Big Thunder Railroad in 1980, and so they wanted to bring a new ride to Frontierland. This ride would come in the form of Geyser Mountain. They wanted to add something that could take advantage of their brand new drop tower technology and also reuse some existing set pieces. Their idea was to use some of the scenery from the Rainbow Caverns from the Mine Train Through Nature's Wonderland, and they wanted to combine it with the drop tower technology to create a Tower of Terror type ride that was set in a more rustic setting. The story of Geyser Mountain was also pretty interesting. The mountain was home to the man responsible for creating the tunnels that you see on Big Thunder Railroad. The line for Geyser Mountain would take guests on a detailed tour of the mountain, which would reveal much of what the man had been working on. The queue would then end with you walking into a barn where his mining vehicle sat. As you sat down, you'd strap in and begin your journey through the colorful and wonderful yet familiar caves, reminiscent of the aforementioned Rainbow Caverns. You would then get to a point where you start crossing this rickety old bridge that had every path in front of it blocked off, with you then realizing where exactly you were, in the middle of the geyser. The geyser would erupt, sending guests bouncing through the air, reaching the tip of the mountain and giving you a stunning view of Frontierland. Unlike Tower of Terror, this ride had more than just drops. You would land on the peak of the mountain and traverse down to the loading and unloading spot. This is why pictures of the ride have a huge track laid out. I imagine after reaching the peak, you'd take a simple slow ride down the entire mountain in whatever mine vehicle you were sat in. The reason for this ride not being made was due to Disney's California Adventure. DCA had costed a lot more money than Disney had initially anticipated. Coupled with the fact that California Adventure did not perform well at all, Disney decided it'd probably be best to not pour a bunch of money into a new ride, and two, build an e-ticket attraction that would take away guests from the California Adventure Park. Eventually, Disney would be able to utilize their drop tower technology in the form of Tower of Terror. This pretty much ended any chance of Geyser Mountain actually being made because, as we've seen from Disney in the past and now, they rarely ever make rides that are very similar to parks that are super close to each other. However, this doesn't mean that Geyser Mountain can't be a future addition at another Disneyland park. It's just very unlikely for us to see Geyser Mountain at the Disneyland resorts in Southern California. The Museum of the Weird. The Museum of the Weird was a walkthrough attraction that I really wish would have been made because I feel like it would have changed the way that Disney ends their rides. You know how nowadays almost every ride ends with you walking straight into a gift shop? Well, the Museum of Weird was supposed to be a walkthrough attraction that guests would enter after getting off the Haunted Mansion ride. It would have been an entire museum dedicated to weird artifacts from all over the world. You'd see these strange voodoo artifacts, a chair that would stand up by itself and talk to park guests, and the craziest of them all, the Candle Man, a life-size man made out of wax with the wicks at the end of his fingers being lit, so he was literally melting right in front of you. Spooky, I know. Now, some sources say that the Museum of Weird was supposed to take place at the front of the Haunted Mansion, apparently happening right before you get into the stretching room. However, other sources cite that the Museum of Weird could have taken place at the end of the Haunted Mansion ride. And whatever the starting point of this is, whether it's at the end or at the beginning, the Museum of Weird would have been a freaking awesome addition to the Haunted Mansion. And I honestly feel like it would have changed the way that rides operate, because nowadays there's no real cool way to end a ride or start a ride. I feel like the coolest ride that has like a really neat like opening is definitely the Haunted Mansion stretching room. But other than that, there's not really anything cool besides like maybe Disney's newest attraction at Galaxy's Edge. Very rarely do you see Disney pour that much effort into a ride, and I feel like this would have been a step in the right direction. Port Disney. Port Disney was an entire planned theme park resort that would accompany the surrounding area of the Queen Mary in Long Beach. Port Disney itself was not the actual amusement park area. Port Disney was the name given to the entire section of land that Disney would use for various ocean-themed attractions. Port Disney featured an ocean-themed Disney park called Disney Sea, marinas, retail and dining areas, as well as a ton of hotels for guests to use. In 1990, Port Disney was announced, and it was supposed to take 10 years to build, hopefully being finished in the year 2000. Like with every other Disney park that's been built, there needed to be a huge focal point of the park. The Disneyland Resort has the iconic Sleeping Beauty Castle, and Disney Sea would have the Oceana, a 2-story aquarium designed to look like floating bubbles in the sea. Guests would be able to see the different habitats and ecosystems, as well as experience interactive exhibits and cool experiments for guests to do. There was even a planned simulator for kids that would simulate the job of deep sea divers. It was also rumored to have some inspiration from the never-built Discoveryland, with some of the rides and attractions possibly being themed around Atlantis. All of this sounded cool, but because of the toll that it would take on the surrounding area and beach life, it received a ton of backlash. This also in part due to the fact that it would have costed billions of dollars to create. Disney shifted their focus to Westcott as Disneyland's second gate. And well, we know exactly how that ended. Now, in a turn of events, Port Disney was actually created. Tokyo's Disney Sea is what would become of the entire Port Disney idea, and it's one of Tokyo's best Disney theme parks. A rather rare turnout for Disney, as we usually see ideas used in other parts of rides, such as Geyser Mountain turning into the Tower of Terror, but in Port Disney's case, Disney just put it off until they had enough money to put it somewhere, and that somewhere just so happened to be at Tokyo Disney. Lafitte Island. Lafitte Island was a rather obscure and neat attraction. This would have been a walkthrough attraction that would have connected Tom Sawyer's Island and New Orleans Square into a new area known as Lafitte Island. What was really cool about this was it was supposed to be the ending to a storyline of the pirate known as Jean Lafitte. If you take time and look around Disneyland, you can see 4 main ties to the pirate known as Lafitte. For example, New Orleans Square has his name plastered all about. You have Lafitte's Anchor, Lafitte's Silver Shop, and other various signs with his name on it. This is because Lafitte was supposed to be the inhabitant of New Orleans Square, and he was also supposed to be the original inhabitant of the Haunted Mansion, which is why if you look at the weather vane that sits atop of the Haunted Mansion, it's a pirate ship. It's a small but subtle hint to Lafitte's pirate background. And Pirates of the Caribbean was supposed to be a simple dramatic retelling of Jean Lafitte's adventures as a pirate, and the lair on Tom Sawyer Island was supposed to be Lafitte's refuge. Lafitte Island was supposed to connect Tom Sawyer's Island and New Orleans Square to this one central hub that would be the new land, and this was supposed to finish up wrapping the story. The story goes that the Haunted Mansion house and the lair on Tom Sawyer's Island were left abandoned until explorers discovered it decades later. With no refugee in sight, they wondered who exactly was there before. Lafitte Island would serve as an answer to this. Underneath the 2 places that he knew as home was an entire island that Lafitte made his own, and it would serve as the last piece of the puzzle connecting all 4 of these distinct attractions of Disneyland. This actually blew my mind. Like, when I read this, I was just like, wow, that would have been freaking awesome. And it's so cool that Disney had planned all of this beforehand, and the remnants are still technically there, which makes it way cooler than it has to be. That's honestly why I wanted to do this Iceberg in the first place. I love Disney lore, and I've been around Disneyland my entire life, and it's just so cool to see this type of stuff, even if it's not, done anymore. Even though like stuff like Lafitte Island wasn't created, the fact that some remnants still exist is just what makes all of this worth it. That will bring us to the end of the entire defunct, abandoned, and extinct Disneyland Iceberg. The reason I call it those many names is just because it's been those 3 names for like the entire series. I've changed the series like 4 or 5 times throughout like the last like year, and it's just because I have no idea what to call it. Just because I feel like calling it the defunct iceberg gets less views, just because I don't know if everyone knows what defunct means, and I feel like abandoned is too long of a title, and extinct is short enough to understand what it is, but it's still a little iffy. Nonetheless, if you guys made it to the end, thank you. Like honestly, thank you guys so much, because like you people that watch these videos to the end are the reason that these videos get pushed out so much, and why I'm able to do this for my job. So just want to say a huge thank you to you guys, because this series would not have been possible without you watching right now. I hope you guys continue to support the channel in the future. As of right now, I'm trying to think of more merch ideas, whether it be like a sweater or a beanie. I really want to get a beanie out because I wear beanies in basically all my videos, just because I'm a huge beanie fan. So if you guys have any ideas in the comments, like just drop them down below and I'll definitely take a look at them. But other than that, I don't think I really have much else to say besides thank you guys for your continued support. And with all that said, I will see you all in the next video. Thanks for watching.